He had $300 million in the bank, a 6-year-old daughter waiting at home, and 30 seconds before his plane hit the ice. The moment Nathan Ashcroft realized he was going to die, he wasn't thinking about the company. He wasn't thinking about the board meeting or the deal that could double his net worth by morning. He was thinking about Sophie, her gap-toothed smile, the way she still left the hall light on when she went to sleep. Then the engine died, and the frozen lake came up fast. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay until the end. Trust me, you'll want to. The altimeter was spinning the wrong direction. Nathan had been flying his Cessna 172 for 11 years without a single serious incident. He knew the instrument panel the way most people know their own kitchen, without looking, without thinking, just feeling. So when the oil pressure gauge spiked red at 18,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies, and the engine coughed like something wet was caught inside it, he didn't panic. He ran the checklist. He stayed calm. That lasted about 45 seconds. "Come on," he muttered, tapping the gauge with 2 fingers the way his first flight instructor had told him never to do. "Come on, come on." The engine didn't answer. It gave one more mechanical groan, something grinding and wrong deep inside the cowling, and then it quit entirely. The propeller slowed, stopped, and suddenly the only sound in the cockpit was the wind and Nathan's own breathing and the faint hiss of snow against the windshield. Outside the windows, there was nothing. Not nothing like darkness, nothing like white. A blizzard had swallowed the Rockies somewhere between Glenwood Springs and Aspen, and Nathan had made the choice 30 minutes ago that he would outrun it. He'd checked the weather at Eagle County Airport before departure. The front wasn't supposed to arrive until 9 p.m. It was 7:43. He'd been wrong. The front had other plans. Denver Center, this is Cessna November 472 Tango Sierra, declaring emergency. He kept his voice flat, professional. The same tone he used in boardrooms when a quarter's numbers came back bad and everyone was watching him for panic. Engine failure. Position approximately 40 miles northwest of Aspen. Altitude 15,400. Attempting forced landing. I am solo pilot. Static. Denver Center was buried under the same storm that was burying him. He tried twice more. Got nothing. The Cessna was gliding now. Gliding was the wrong word. It was falling with manners. And Nathan was scanning the ground below for anything that wasn't a cliff face or a tree line. Through the swirling white, he could see almost nothing. The mountain terrain below was a gray-black mass of ridgelines and shadows. No road, no clearing, no flat ground. He dropped below the cloud layer and the visibility opened up slightly, enough for him to see that he was descending over a narrow valley. Pines on 3 sides. And ahead there was something lighter. A pale expanse between 2 ridges. A lake. It was maybe 800 meters long, covered in snow-dusted ice, and it was the only thing between Nathan Ashcroft and a pine forest at 90 miles an hour. He lined it up. "Sophie," he said out loud. Not a prayer, not really, just her name because it was the only word that felt important right now. "Sophie, bug, I'm coming home." He came in too fast. He knew it the moment he crossed the tree line at the lake's edge. The airspeed was 40 knots higher than a textbook forced landing on ice, and he had no power, no go-around, no second chance. He hauled back on the yoke to bleed speed and the nose came up, and the stall warning horn screamed, and then the main gear hit the ice with a crack that he felt in his spine. The plane skidded. He had no brakes worth speaking of on ice. He pumped them anyway, both feet stabbing, and the Cessna fishtailed left and the right wing dipped and the wingtip caught the surface and Nathan's world went sideways, literally, violently sideways, as the aircraft spun 130 degrees and slammed to a stop with the left wing buried in a snowbank at the lake's edge. Then silence. Nathan sat still for a long moment. His hands were still locked on the controls. There was a warm sensation above his right eyebrow, and when he touched it, his fingers came away dark. The windshield had a spiderweb crack across the lower third. Steam or smoke, he couldn't tell which, was drifting past the side window. Fire. That was his first clear thought. Get out. He fought the door. The frame had bent slightly in the impact, and it took 3 hard shoves with his shoulder before it gave. Cold hit him like something physical, like a wall, like being pushed backward. The temperature outside was probably somewhere between 15 and 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind made it feel worse. He stumbled out onto the ice, his left leg taking his weight wrong and sending a white bolt of pain up through his knee, and he moved away from the aircraft in a sliding, limping half-run. 20 meters, 30. He stopped and turned, watched. No fire. The smoke was steam from hot metal meeting frozen air. The plane sat crumpled against the snowbank, one wing cocked upward at an angle that meant it was never flying again, but it wasn't burning. Nathan let out a long, unsteady breath that turned to vapor instantly. He took stock of himself. Head, cut above the eyebrow, still bleeding, not gushing. Knee, swollen, painful, functional. Ribs. He pressed his right side and hissed, probably bruised, maybe cracked, not broken through. Everything else. Cold. Getting colder. His cell phone had 3% battery and no signal. His emergency kit was in the aircraft. A small first aid bag, 2 emergency blankets, a handheld radio that he now remembered he had not charged since July. He went back for it. The radio was dead. The blankets he wrapped around his shoulders. He ate the 2 protein bars in the kit standing next to the wreck because his hands were already shaking and he needed calories. Then he looked around. The lake was surrounded by mountains. Through the blowing snow, he could see nothing that suggested civilization. No lights, no road, no structure of any kind. The storm was worsening. The temperature was dropping. He was losing blood from his head. His knee was going to stiffen in this cold. And if he stayed by the plane overnight, which every survival manual said you should do, stay with the aircraft, make it easy for searchers, he was going to die. He didn't stay with the aircraft. Nathan Ashcroft had not gotten where he was by following conventional wisdom when the situation called for something else. He pulled the emergency blankets tighter, found the small flashlight from the kit, picked a direction, the eastern tree line, where the terrain looked like it sloped downward. Downward meant valley, valley meant water. Water sometimes meant people. And he started walking. He walked for 40 minutes before he saw the light. It was barely anything. A smear of amber through the trees, so faint he almost convinced himself it was his eyes playing tricks. But it was there, warm-toned, yellowish, the color of a window with something burning behind it. Not a streetlight, not a vehicle. A window. Nathan altered course toward it and said nothing out loud because there was no one to say anything to, and because somewhere around the 20-minute mark he had stopped being able to feel his left foot, and he was reserving what was left of his mental energy for putting one foot in front of the other. The trees thinned. A small clearing opened up. And in the clearing, barely visible through the snow, was a cabin. It was a modest structure, maybe 800 square feet, single story, with a covered porch sagging slightly on the left side where one of the support posts had cracked and been repaired with a 2x4 that didn't quite match. There was a woodpile against the outside wall, about 2/3 full. A battered pickup truck sat under a canvas tarp beside the cabin, and even from 15 feet away, Nathan could see that 2 of the tires were flat. The porch light was off. The warmth was coming from a window on the right side. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked harder, 3 solid raps, and stamped his feet because the feeling was coming back into his left foot in the worst possible way. Pins and needles and something deeper, something that hurt like a bone ache. The door opened 4 inches, stopped by a chain, and a woman looked at him through the gap. She was maybe 30, dark hair pulled back messily, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans like she'd been sitting in front of the fire for hours. Her eyes moved from his face, which he knew must have looked terrible, bloody and pale, down to his body and back. "What happened to you?" she said. Not a welcome, not a threat, a question, flat and direct. "My plane went down," Nathan said. "On the lake. About a mile west of here. I walked out." "Your plane?" "Small aircraft, single engine. I'm sorry to knock on your door in the middle of the night. I didn't have—" "Come in." She unhooked the chain. "Don't argue with me about it. Just come in." He came in. The cabin was warmer than he expected and smaller than it had looked from outside. A wood-burning stove in the corner was doing the heavy lifting, and it was doing it well. The smell was pine smoke and something faintly sweet, cinnamon maybe, or dried herbs hanging in a bundle above the kitchen window. Nathan stood just inside the door and dripped melted snow onto a doormat that was already past the point of redemption. "Sit down," the woman said, pointing to a chair at the kitchen table, "before you fall down." He sat. She was already moving. To the sink, running water, opening a cabinet above the stove where a small first aid kit was stored. She moved efficiently, without fuss, the way someone moves when they're used to handling problems alone. She didn't ask him 10 more questions. She pulled up a chair across from him, wet a clean cloth, and reached for his face. "This is going to sting," she said. "I know." It did. She cleaned the cut above his eyebrow with the focus of someone who'd done this kind of thing before, not necessarily on other people, but on herself. There were small white scars on her left forearm, the kind you get from working with tools or farm equipment. Her hands were steady. "I'm Nathan," he said. "Lena." She didn't look up from what she was doing. "How fast were you going when you hit?" "Too fast." "Obviously, approximately." 90, maybe 95 knots. I didn't have power to bleed off speed properly. She nodded, like this explained something. "You're going to need stitches on this. I have a suture kit. It's for emergencies. It's not hospital grade, but it'll close this up properly." She sat back. "I should tell you that I'm not a doctor. I'm not anything medical. I learned from a YouTube channel and a first aid book because the nearest urgent care is 37 miles from here and the road closes in winter." "That's fine," Nathan said. "Please." She gave him a long, direct look, assessing something he couldn't quite name. Then she nodded and went to get what she needed. "Can I ask," Nathan said while she prepared, is there anyone else here? Family? Husband?" "No." The word came out clean and final. No emotion attached to it. The way people say things they've said enough times that the feeling has worn off. "Just me." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's just a fact." She came back with the kit. "You'll want to hold still and maybe grip the table." He gripped the table. She put in 4 stitches. They were neat and even, and she worked with a calm, methodical focus that distracted Nathan enough that he almost forgot the pain. Almost. When she was done, she wrapped his head with gauze and taped it and leaned back to look at her work. "Knee?" she said. "How did you—" "You're favoring your left leg. You have been since you walked in. It's swollen. I don't think it's structural. Take your boot off. Let me look." He did. She pressed the joint with careful fingers, feeling for wrongness, asking him where it hurt. Her diagnosis matched his. Swollen, probably a bad sprain, nothing torn. She wrapped it with an elastic bandage from the kit and told him to keep it elevated. "Are you hungry?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. "I don't want to take your food." "I didn't ask if you wanted to take it. I asked if you were hungry." "Yes." She went to the kitchen. He heard cabinet doors, the soft sound of a pot being placed on a burner. He looked around the cabin while she cooked. There wasn't much. A bookshelf against one wall, mostly paperbacks. A few library books with their spines bent from use. A small table with a sewing project half finished on it. A framed photograph on the mantel above the stove that he couldn't see clearly from where he sat. The furniture was mismatched and worn, the kind of pieces that had been acquired over years from different places and different budgets, not chosen to go together. But it was clean. Everything was clean and organized and in its place, with the particular neatness of someone who takes care of what they have, because replacing it isn't an option. Lena came back with a bowl of soup, bean soup, thick, with dark bread on the side, and set it in front of him. "Eat," she said, sitting across from him with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she'd poured for herself. Just herself. She hadn't offered him any, and he noticed she wasn't going to go back for a second mug, which meant she probably didn't have enough coffee left to be generous with it. He ate. The soup was good. Simple and filling, and better than it had any right to be given that he suspected the pantry behind her was not fully stocked. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet. The storm's bad and it's getting worse. You're not going anywhere tonight." "I understand." "There's one bed in this cabin," she said, "and you're not sleeping in it. There's a cot in the storage room off the kitchen. It's clean. There are extra blankets. Your clothes are wet. There's a hook by the stove. Hang them there." "I can sleep in the chair." You'll wake up unable to walk. Don't be difficult. She stood, took his empty bowl. I need your real name, your full name, in case I need to tell someone who you are in the morning. Something moved in Nathan's chest. Not guilt exactly. Not yet. More like a small, quiet decision being made before he was fully aware he was making it. Nathan Ashcroft, he said. Which was true. All of it was true. She nodded and wrote it on a notepad on the counter, presumably so she'd have it in the morning if she needed to call someone or if he didn't wake up. Get some rest, Lena said. We'll figure out the rest when it's light. He didn't sleep for a long time. He lay on the cot in the small storage room with his knee elevated on a folded blanket and stared at the ceiling. It was low, unpainted wood with a small water stain in one corner that had dried and been there long enough to just be part of the ceiling now. The wind outside was something violent. The whole cabin shifted slightly in the gusts, the walls settling and sighing like an old dog finding a comfortable position. Nathan's phone was dead. He knew that, but his hand kept going to his pocket anyway, the automated reach of someone who had spent 15 years checking messages, answering calls, responding to the world at all hours. The muscle memory was apparently stronger than the rational understanding that the phone was a black rectangle that did nothing now. There would be people looking for him. He'd filed a flight plan, rifle to Aspen, estimated arrival 7:55 p.m. When he didn't land and didn't answer, the system would flag it. Marcus, his VP of operations and the closest thing he had to a right-hand man, would get a call. Marcus would deploy every resource available, which was considerable. The company's PR department would be managing the information. There would be a search by morning, but tonight there was a blizzard that grounded everything with wings, and until it broke, nobody was finding the lake. He thought about Sophie. She was with Mrs. Ellison tonight, his neighbor, a retired teacher in her 60s who loved Sophie genuinely and who Sophie called Nana Beth, even though they shared no blood. Sophie would be asleep. She went to bed at 8:30 and she slept hard and deep the way 6-year-olds do, and she wouldn't know anything was wrong until morning. And by morning, maybe the storm would break and he'd be found. Maybe. He breathed carefully. His ribs were worse horizontal than sitting, a dull ache with every expansion of his lungs. And he thought about the woman in the next room. Lena. No last name offered. She'd taken in a bleeding stranger without hesitation and stitched his face and fed him and organized his lodging with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who couldn't afford to be sentimental about it. She hadn't asked him what he did or where he was going or why he was flying in those conditions. She'd just handled it. He didn't know why, but something about that made him feel ashamed. Not of her, of himself. Or not exactly ashamed. More like aware, suddenly, of the texture of his own life by comparison. The teams of people whose entire function was to handle things so that he didn't have to. The handlers and fixers and assistants and security details and legal teams. The entire infrastructure of removal that stood between Nathan Ashcroft and any situation that required him to just figure something out with his own two hands. Here, in this cabin, there was no infrastructure. There was a woman who'd learned to suture wounds from YouTube because the alternative was bleeding out before reaching the highway. He closed his eyes. His ribs ached. Outside, the storm howled. He fell asleep thinking about Sophie, which was how he fell asleep most nights. Dawn came in gray and muffled by snow. Nathan woke to the sound of wood being split outside. A rhythmic crack, pause, crack, steady and practiced. He sat up, felt the full inventory of his damage, ribs, knee, head, and managed to get to his feet by going slowly and holding the wall. He found his clothes on the hook by the stove, dry now. He dressed and went to the window. Lena was in the yard, splitting firewood. She'd been at it for a while by the looks of it, a good stack growing beside the covered pile. She swung the axe with the efficient economy of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, not straining, just placing the force where it needed to go. The storm was still going. The sky was the same featureless white it had been last night, and snow was falling, though not as violently as before. Nathan found a mug, found coffee. There wasn't much of it, ground, not whole bean, and made a small pot. He poured 2 mugs and carried them both to the door, opened it, and stepped onto the porch. "Coffee," he said. Lena turned. She was wearing a canvas work jacket and wool gloves with the fingers cut away. Her cheeks were red from the cold. She looked at the mug he was holding out like she was assessing whether to be annoyed. She came to the porch and took it. "Your color's better," she said, studying his face. "I slept." "Good." She drank. "There's no cell service. Landline's been out since October. Someone cut through it during the road work and they haven't fixed it." "I know. I assumed." "They'll be looking for you, though. Flight plan?" "Yes." "Then it's a waiting game. Storm should break tomorrow morning if the forecast I heard 2 days ago was right." She looked back at the wood she'd been splitting. "I need to get another cord done before the temperature drops tonight." "I'll help," Nathan said. She gave him the look again. That flat assessing thing. "Your knee? I can split wood with a bad knee." He paused. "If you have another axe." A moment. Then she set down her mug on the porch rail and went around the side of the cabin and came back with a hatchet that was probably meant for kindling but would do the job. She handed it to him without comment. They worked side by side for an hour. Nathan was slower than her and less efficient. His swing took more effort to generate the same result, and after the first 20 minutes, his ribs were making themselves known in a persistent and unhappy way. But he didn't stop. He didn't mention the ribs. He just worked. After a while, Lena said, without stopping her own rhythm, "You've never split wood before. That obvious? You keep trying to put the force in your arms. It comes from your hips." "Show me." She stopped, looked at him, then came over. She stood beside him, close enough to demonstrate, and she adjusted the angle of his grip on the handle and talked him through the weight transfer. It took 3 more swings to get it right, and when he did, when the force moved the way she described, through his hips and shoulders, and the log split cleanly with a fraction of the effort, he felt something disproportionately satisfying about it. "There you go," Lena said, and went back to her own work. Nathan kept splitting wood and didn't say anything for a while because he was too busy noticing that he couldn't remember the last time someone had taught him something with their hands. By midday, the temperature had dropped 5 more degrees and they were both inside. Lena made lunch from what she had: rice, canned black beans, some dried peppers she'd strung above the window. She cooked it on the propane burner because the electricity was still out, moving through the small kitchen with the economy of someone who had learned to make things stretch. Nathan sat at the table and watched, and didn't offer to help, because he had the sense she didn't want him in her kitchen, and because watching her cook was informative. She was measuring by eye, not by recipe. She tasted and adjusted twice. She was making something good out of almost nothing, and the almost nothing part was not hypothetical. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can try." "How long have you been out here?" Lena was quiet for a moment, stirring. "About 14 months. "Alone?" "I just told you, yes." "Before that?" She set the spoon down and turned to look at him. "You're asking a lot of questions for someone I found bleeding on my porch." "You're right. I'm sorry." She turned back to the stove. A minute passed. Then, "I had an apartment in Denver. I had a job. Marketing, mid-level, the kind of thing that sounds more interesting than it is. I had a person." Another pause. "That fell apart. The job fell apart around the same time. Company restructured, my whole department got eliminated, and my father left me this land, this cabin. So you came here." "I came here." She plated the food, brought it to the table. "It was supposed to be temporary. That was 14 months ago." Nathan looked at her. She sat across from him and picked up her fork with a deliberate normalcy. The particular body language of someone who has said more than they intended and is moving the conversation along by force of habit. "It sounds like a lot of loss at once," Nathan said carefully. It was. She ate. "Pass the bread." He passed the bread. They ate in a quiet that was not entirely comfortable, but not hostile. It was the quiet of 2 people sitting with something unspoken and choosing, for now, to leave it there. "Do you have kids?" Lena asked eventually. The question surprised him. He looked up from his bowl. "A daughter," he said. "Sophie. She's 6. Something shifted in Lena's expression. Subtle, just a softening around the eyes. "Is she—" She stopped, started again. "Her mother?" She passed away, Nathan said, when Sophie was 3. I'm sorry. It was sudden. Aneurysm. She went to sleep one night and didn't wake up. He said it the same way he always said it, the flat version, the one that had the horror pressed out of it by repetition. Sophie doesn't remember her, not really. She has photographs. She knows the story. But the actual memory of her, it's not there. Lena was quiet for a moment. Does that make it better or worse? For Sophie? I don't know, Nathan said honestly. I used to think better. She's not grieving someone she knew, but now I think maybe worse. Because she's going to spend her whole childhood trying to construct a person out of photographs and stories, and she'll never know if she got it right. Lena set her fork down. She wasn't looking at him with pity, which he appreciated. She was looking at him with something more like recognition. Who's with her now? She asked. While you're here. A neighbor. A good one. Sophie loves her. He paused. She knows I'm away. She doesn't know. He stopped. She doesn't know about the crash. No one does. Yet. They will, Lena said. I know. Outside, the wind found a gap somewhere in the cabin's structure and whistled through it, a thin, high-pitched note that lasted 2 seconds and then was gone. She's lucky, Lena said finally, to have a father who thinks about how things will affect her, who worries about what she'll carry. She picked her fork back up. That's not nothing, Nathan. He didn't respond right away. He sat with the words. Not because they were flattering, but because they were specific, and because she'd said his name, and because somehow in the context of this cabin in the middle of a blizzard, with a stranger who'd stitched his face and fed him from her last provisions, being seen clearly felt like something he hadn't expected tonight. Thank you, he said. Lena shrugged and ate her rice and didn't make anything of it. The afternoon passed slowly, the way afternoons do in bad weather, when you have nowhere to be and nothing to rush toward. Nathan found a problem in the cabin that needed addressing. He noticed it the way he always noticed things that weren't working right, the slight unevenness of the back door that meant it was sitting wrong in its frame, letting a thin draft of frozen air across the kitchen floor. He found tools in the storage room, a kit that was old but well organized, and he spent 90 minutes planing the bottom of the door and resetting the hinges. Lena walked through while he was working and stopped. When did you notice that? She said. This morning. It's been letting in cold along the floor. She looked at the door, then at him, with an expression he couldn't quite read. I've been dealing with that draft for 3 months. It's a 20-minute fix. I know it's a 20-minute fix. She stopped. I haven't had tools. Nathan looked at the kit in his hands, then at her. These are in your storage room. Those were my dad's. She made a small gesture. I didn't want to get into his tools. He understood that immediately and completely. He put the tools down on the floor carefully and stepped back from them. I should have asked, he said. I'm sorry, No. She shook her head. No, you were right to fix it. It's fine. She looked at the door again. It's good, thank you. She left the kitchen. Nathan finished the door. When he came back to the main room, Lena was sitting in the armchair by the wood stove with a book open in her lap, but she wasn't reading it. She was looking at the photograph on the mantel. Nathan sat on the couch across from her and said nothing. After a while, she said, That's my dad. And my mother, on the left. She died when I was 9. Nathan looked at the photograph properly now. A man in his 50s, big-shouldered, with a square jaw and Lena's same direct eyes. A woman on his left, thin, dark-haired, with a full smile. A girl between them, who could only be Lena at 7 or 8, gap-toothed and squinting into the sun. He built this cabin, Lena said. Not professionally. He just decided to one summer, and he did it. He was like that. A pause. He died 2 years ago. Heart attack. I found out the same week I found out my boyfriend of 4 years had been seeing someone else for 8 months of it. She said it lightly, the tone of someone reading from a list of unfortunate weather events. So, it was a bad month. Nathan said nothing. He didn't offer condolences or perspective or the usual reflexive things people say when someone describes loss. He just let it sit. Lena looked at him. Most people say they're sorry. I am sorry. It's just a useless thing to say. She studied him for a moment. Yeah, she said. It is. She looked back at the photograph. He would have liked you, she said, and she seemed surprised by her own words, like they'd come out before she'd decided to say them. He had no patience for people who filled silence with noise. He always said most people talk to avoid thinking. Nathan said nothing. Lena laughed. A small, short sound, surprised. You're doing it on purpose. Little bit. That's annoying. Sorry. But she was still almost smiling, and the fire crackled in the stove, and for a few hours the storm seemed very far away. By evening, the temperature outside had dropped to what Nathan estimated was well below zero, and inside the cabin was a careful management of warmth. Lena fed the stove with precision, not wastefully, the way someone who has counted their firewood supply thinks about every log. They made dinner together this time. Lena's kitchen, Lena's rules, but Nathan was permitted to wash vegetables and stir things when she needed her hands free. He burned the onions he was supposed to be watching. She took over without comment and saved them. You can't cook, she said. I have people who cook for me. Of course you do. I didn't mean it like that. How did you mean it? He thought about it. Honestly? I'm not sure. I've been saying I have people who handle that for so long I've stopped noticing when it sounds wrong. Lena turned from the stove. She looked at him directly, the way she'd been doing since he arrived. That flat, clear-eyed look that had no agenda in it, wasn't trying to make him feel anything in particular, was just looking. What do you do? She said. For work. Nathan was quiet for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, he made a choice, and the choice was not exactly a lie. Everything he said was technically true. But it was a withholding, a shaping of the truth into a smaller version of itself. Business, he said. Corporate. I run a company. What kind of company? Technology and logistics, supply chain management, software infrastructure. He said it in the most generic, flattening way he could, the way you'd say it if you wanted to end the conversation. It's not very interesting. Lena nodded and turned back to the stove. You don't seem like a corporate person. What do I seem like? She considered. Someone who's been corporate for a long time and is tired of it. He had no answer to that, because it was accurate in a way that landed somewhere uncomfortable. Dinner was pasta. She'd found a bag of it in the back of a cabinet, and there was a jar of tomato preserves she'd put up herself in the fall. Simple. They ate by candlelight because the electricity was still out and the propane lantern was running low. Tell me something about Sophie, Lena said. And Nathan talked. He talked about Sophie the way he never talked about her in business contexts, not the proud father in passing way, the quick mention and deflection that was all he allowed himself in professional settings. He told Lena about the way Sophie had decided at age 4 that she was going to be both a marine biologist and a pastry chef, a commitment she had maintained for 2 full years with absolute seriousness. He told her about the phase where Sophie had named every tree in the yard of their house in Connecticut, full names, including middle names, and got angry when Nathan called them by the wrong one. He told her about a morning 6 months ago when he'd come downstairs at 5 a.m. to find Sophie sitting at the kitchen table in her pajamas with a piece of paper, drawing a portrait of his late wife from a photograph. When he'd asked what she was doing, Sophie had said very calmly, I'm trying to get her face right. I look at her a lot, but I still can't remember if it's right. He stopped talking. He hadn't told anyone that story before. He hadn't even thought about it much, had filed it under things that were hard and moved on, the way he moved on from things. Lena was watching him from across the table. She sounds remarkable, she said quietly. She is. He cleared his throat. She's the only thing I've ever done that I'm certain about. You love her without condition, Lena said. Not a question. Yes. That's not as common as people think it should be. The candle between them burned lower. Outside, the wind made it sound against the walls. Nathan looked at this woman, a stranger 2 days ago, a stranger technically now, and thought that she was one of the most honest people he had ever been in a room with, not in the sense of being blunt or forthright, in the older sense, in the sense of being genuinely, simply, exactly what she appeared to be. And he had not told her who he was. The thought sat in his chest like a splinter. Small, not dangerous, but impossible to ignore. The second night was quieter than the first. Nathan lay on the cot, and this time he did not stare at the ceiling. He fell asleep quickly, which hadn't happened in, he thought about it, more than a year. He fell asleep without the usual machinery running, the endless cycle of tomorrow's decisions and yesterday's consequences, and the weight of 2,000 employees whose livelihoods depended on the choices he made with his brain every day. He slept like a man with a clear conscience, which was almost entirely unjustified, but that was the truth of it. In the morning, Lena had coffee ready before he woke up. She'd made enough for 2 mugs this time, which meant she'd decided he was worth the allocation. He took this as a sign of something, though he wasn't sure exactly what. The storm had changed, still snowing, but the wind had dropped to something manageable and the sky was lighter, pale gray instead of solid white. By afternoon, the clouds had a different quality, broken, with the occasional glimpse of something bluer behind them. "Tomorrow," Lena said, looking out the window. "By tomorrow morning, it'll break." Nathan nodded. The day passed. He found more things that needed fixing. A shutter hinge that had rusted. A gap in the insulation around the kitchen window that he packed with material from the storage room. He was careful with the tools, returning each one to where he'd found it, the way her father had probably put them. In the late afternoon, Lena taught him to make the bread she made. A simple yeasted loaf, nothing complicated but requiring patience in the proofing and a particular way of scoring the top before it went in the oven. His first loaf came out with a flat top and a slight cave on one side. "It's still bread," Lena said. "It looks like a geological event." "It tastes fine, that's the point." He ate a piece of it with butter she'd had in the cold outside, and it did, in fact, taste fine. What he felt that afternoon, sitting at a kitchen table in a small cabin in the middle of a Colorado mountain winter, eating imperfect bread, talking about nothing important with a woman who didn't know who he was, he wouldn't have been able to name precisely. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was something quieter than happiness. Something like relief. Like setting something heavy down. Like remembering that you had a body that could sit still. The feeling was so foreign that for a moment he almost identified it as something wrong. Then he recognized it. He hadn't felt it since before his wife died. Maybe before that. Maybe since Sophie was born and the world became a constant performance of competence and strength. He felt, for the first time in years, like a person rather than a function. He sat with the bread and the butter and the dying afternoon and let himself have it, because tomorrow the storm was going to break and people were going to find him, and this, whatever this was going to end. The morning the storm broke, Nathan woke before Lena. He lay still for a moment on the cot, listening. The wind had stopped. That was the first thing. The absence of it, the sudden quiet that comes after 2 days of constant noise, a silence so complete it felt like something had been removed from the air itself. He could hear the wood settling in the stove in the next room. He could hear snow falling from the cabin roof in heavy slides, hitting the ground in dull, soft impacts. He could hear, faintly, a bird somewhere in the tree line. A single note, repeated. He got up slowly. His knee had stiffened overnight, and he stood against the wall for a moment, letting the joint remember how to work, before he moved into the kitchen. He put water on for coffee, found the bread they'd made yesterday, his geological event, Lena's better loaf, and cut 2 slices of each. He put them on the plate and stood at the window. The world outside was white and completely still. The trees wore the snow in great heavy folds, bent under it but not broken. The sky was the pale flat gray that comes just before the blue returns, and at the eastern ridge Nathan could see the first thin seam of light beginning to separate the mountains from the clouds. He stood there for a while with his hands around the warm mug, and he did not think about anything specific. He just looked at the light coming back. He heard Lena's door open. Her footsteps. She had a particular walk, unhurried, no wasted motion, crossed the bedroom floor, and then she was in the kitchen doorway. She'd pulled her hair back, and she was wearing the same flannel shirt, and she looked at the plate on the table with the bread already cut, and the second mug of coffee waiting, and something crossed her face that she smoothed away before he could identify it. She sat down. "Storm's done," Nathan said. "I can tell." She picked up the mug. They'll find the plane today. Probably send someone up here. Probably. She looked at him. You could use the ridge road to walk out. It's about 4 miles to the county highway from here. Once the plows come through. I'll wait, he said. If that's all right. She considered this, nodded once. They ate the bread and drank the coffee, and the morning came in through the window, steady and cold and clear. What neither of them said, though both of them felt it in some way they couldn't have articulated, was that they were holding the last hours of something. That once the highway opened and the phone came back and the world found Nathan Ashcroft, the particular gravity of this place, the enforced simplicity of it, the 2 people and 4 walls and a wood stove and nothing else, would be over. You can't unknow that something is ending. You just sit with it. Lena heated more water, and Nathan fixed the broken latch on the kitchen window that he'd been meaning to get to the day before but hadn't. He worked carefully and without hurry, and she watched him once or twice from across the room with an expression that wasn't quite readable. "You're good with your hands," she said, "for a corporate person. I grew up with a father who thought idle hands were a personal failing." He tightened the last screw. "He built furniture in the garage on weekends. Made me help every Saturday from age 7 until I left for college." "Do you still do it? Build things?" He thought about it. "No, I haven't in years." The answer sat in the air between them in a way that felt slightly self-incriminating, though she didn't say anything about it. "My dad was the same," Lena said. "He believed that if something was broken and you had the ability to fix it, leaving it broken was a kind of laziness, a moral thing, almost." She paused. "I think that's why I didn't use his tools. I wasn't ready to be the person in this cabin who fixed things. It felt like accepting that he wasn't coming back to do it." Nathan said nothing. He put the screwdriver back in the kit. "But things break whether you're ready or not," she said, with a matter-of-fact flatness that wasn't bitterness. Just the observation of someone who'd collected enough evidence to be certain of it. So, Nathan agreed. She almost smiled at that. He caught the edge of it before she looked away. They were outside mid-morning, splitting the last of the wood Nathan had promised to help with when they heard it, a low mechanical thrum in the distance that grew slowly into the unmistakable sound of a helicopter. Nathan stopped. The sound came from the west, grew louder, and then the aircraft came over the ridge, a red and white helicopter, the mountain search and rescue markings clear against the pale sky, and it banked south toward the lake. Lena was watching him. "That's for you," she said. "Yes." She studied his face for a moment with that direct look, and he knew she was reading something in it, some tension he hadn't managed to neutralize before she saw it. He wasn't certain what she was reading. He wasn't certain he knew himself. "Should I flag them?" she asked. "They'll find the plane first, then they'll search the area. I should probably—" He handed back the hatchet. "I should let them know I'm here." They walked to the edge of the clearing, Lena a half step behind him, and Nathan waved at the helicopter as it came back around. It banked toward them immediately. They'd been seen, and it dropped lower and circled the cabin once. Through the side window, Nathan could see a figure with a radio. He raised both arms. The helicopter moved toward the lake, presumably to find a landing spot on the ice. "I need to go meet them," Nathan said. "I know." He turned. She was standing at the edge of her cleared yard, her arms crossed against the cold, looking at him with the particular expression of someone being practical about something that has a feeling underneath it. "Lena." He stopped. He almost said something. Several somethings formed and dissolved. "I want to, when I get back to where I can, I'd like to repay you. For the food, the medical care, the shelter. I want to do that properly." Her expression shifted slightly. "You don't need to do that. I know I don't need to. I want to." "Nathan." She said his name in a particular way. Not unkind, but certain. "You helped with the wood. You fixed the door, and the window latch, and the shutter hinge, and you made me laugh twice, which is more than I can say for most of November." She paused. "We're even." He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't think we are, but I understand what you're saying." She unfolded her arms. "Go. They're waiting. He went. He walked across the snow toward the lake, and he didn't look back because he knew if he looked back he would have to contend with whatever he was feeling, and what he was feeling was large and not yet shapeable into words. He didn't look back. He almost made it. At the tree line he stopped. He turned. She was still standing at the edge of the yard, watching him go. When she saw him turn, she didn't wave or change her expression. She just looked. He looked back. Then he went into the trees. He didn't know that she stood there for a long time after he disappeared. The search and rescue team was professional and efficient, and within 12 minutes of reaching the helicopter, Nathan had a blanket over his shoulders, a paramedic checking his vitals, and his cell phone. A rescue team member had brought a portable charger, showing 37 missed calls and 16 voicemails, and a number of text messages that began to arrive in a cascade the moment it connected to the network. The first voicemail was Marcus, measured and careful, from 11 p.m. 2 nights ago. Nathan, the FAA, flagged you as overdue. I've contacted the search team. Call when you can. The second was Marcus again, 6 a.m. the following morning, less measured. Nathan, they found your flight plan, but the storm has search teams grounded. I've got the company helicopter on standby. I need to know you're alive, man. Call me. The fifth was his assistant, Claire, trying and failing to sound calm. The sixth was his lawyer. The seventh was his lawyer. The seventh was the PR director, which told Nathan that the story was already out somewhere, because the PR director didn't call unless the story was out. He called Marcus first. Nathan, thank God. Marcus's voice cracked on the second word, which meant the situation had genuinely frightened him, which meant it had been bad enough to frighten a man who was professionally unflappable. Where are you? Are you hurt? What? I'm fine. Head laceration, sprained knee, bruised ribs. The plane is gone. He paused. I was sheltered at a cabin near the lake. A woman named Lena Brooks. She took me in, stitched me up. I'm okay, Marcus. A breath on the other end. Then, the board's been calling. The Meredith deal is on hold pending your availability. The press picked it up. Somebody at the FAA leaked the emergency declaration, and it's been on the financial news since yesterday morning. Nathan closed his eyes. How bad? Stock dropped 2% when the news broke, recovered by close. People are rattled. I'll make a statement when I land. Have Claire set it up for this afternoon. He paused. And Marcus, find out what this woman needs. Lena Brooks, cabin at the north end of a lake about a mile into the ridge above the county road. I want to know. He stopped himself. Reconsidered. Actually, don't. Not yet. Okay, Marcus said, without asking why, because Marcus was very good at his job. How's Sophie? Fine. Mrs. Ellison had her. She's been told you had a travel delay. She drew you a picture of the plane. Something in Nathan's chest tightened and then released. Of course she did. He rang off and sat on the helicopter bench with the blanket around his shoulders and watched the paramedic make notes on a clipboard. The rotors were spinning now, ready to lift. Through the side window he could see the lake, the wreckage of his Cessna against the snowbank. The wings still pointed wrong at the sky. The tracks he'd made in the snow 2 nights ago still visible in the fresh snowfall, a wandering line from the plane toward the eastern tree line. He followed the line with his eyes until it disappeared into the pines. Somewhere beyond those trees was a clearing, a cabin. A woman with a first aid kit and strong coffee and a father's tools she hadn't been ready to use. The helicopter lifted. The lake dropped away below them, and then the trees closed over it, and there was nothing but white mountains in every direction. Nathan watched until there was nothing left to see. He did not tell anyone, in the statement that afternoon or in the days that followed, about the 2 days in the cabin. He described the crash. He described sheltering with a local resident. He named Lena Brooks, gave her appropriate credit for the assistance, said she had been generous and capable. But the specifics, the bread, the wood splitting, the conversation in the candlelight, Sophie's portrait, those he kept. He didn't examine why particularly. He just kept them. He flew back to Connecticut and walked through the door of his house, and Sophie came at him from the hallway like a small missile, arms wide, and he caught her and held on. You were gone a long time, she said into his shoulder. I know. I'm sorry, Bug. Mrs. Ellison said you had a travel delay. That's right. She pulled back and looked at his face, at the bandaged cut above his eyebrow, which he'd kept neatly covered. She stared at it. He watched her processing it. Did something happen to your head? I bumped it. I'm fine. She reached up with 2 fingers and very gently touched the edge of the bandage. Does it hurt? Not much. She seemed to accept this because 6-year-olds have the capacity to accept things with a completeness that adults lose somewhere around adolescence. She dropped her hand. I drew you a picture of your airplane. I heard. Can I see it? She took him by the hand and led him to the kitchen table where the drawing was waiting. A crayon rendition of a small white plane, very detailed for a 6-year-old, with what appeared to be a sunrise or sunset behind it in orange and yellow. In the corner, she had written Dad's plane in careful letters, each one a slightly different size. He looked at it for a long moment. It's beautiful, Sophie. The wheels are wrong, she said critically. I couldn't remember which way they go. The wheels are perfect, he said, and she leaned against his arm and he held her there in the kitchen of their house in Connecticut and felt, simultaneously, enormous gratitude and something that was not quite grief but lived in the same neighborhood. The weeks that followed were the usual weeks, which was to say they were relentless. The Meredith deal, which was a $38 million acquisition of a mid-sized logistics software company, had been paused and needed restarting. The board wanted a full post-incident review of his travel protocols, specifically his habit of flying himself on a small aircraft for business trips, which they had apparently been tolerating for years and now decided was a liability. His head healed. His knee healed slower, complained on stairs and in cold weather, left him with a slight stiffness in the mornings that the doctor said might be permanent or might resolve in a year. Hard to say. He thought about Lena. Not obsessively, not in the way that would have made him uncomfortable with himself, but with regularity, in the spaces between things, in the car, at his desk between calls, at night after Sophie was asleep and the house had its particular quiet. He thought about the bread and the way she'd corrected his axe swing and the things she'd said about her father's tools and the moment at the edge of the yard where she'd watched him walk into the trees. He found himself wondering how the wood supply was holding, whether the flat tire truck was an ongoing problem or whether someone had sorted it, whether she was okay. He did not have her contact information. He had her name, her location, and the knowledge that there was no working landline and no cell signal at the cabin. He could have had Marcus look into it, not intrusively, just confirm she was all right, make sure there wasn't a need that could be met. He started to ask Marcus to do this 3 times and stopped himself 3 times. He wasn't sure if he was being respectful of her privacy or just protecting himself from the obligation of doing something with whatever he found out. Probably both. 6 weeks after the crash, on a Tuesday in January, he found himself buying a bag of good coffee, a specific single-origin Colombian bean that he'd picked because it was the opposite of instant and the opposite of the powdery approximation she'd had in the cabin, and putting it in a box along with a handwritten note that said only, "You saved my life. Thank you. Nathan." He addressed it to the county road, the closest mailing address he could link to her location, and he sent it. He felt ridiculous about this for 3 days and then forgot about it. Or didn't forget about it, but filed it under addressed. Marcus brought the Meredith acquisition back to the table in February. It was a good deal and Nathan knew it. The company's infrastructure integration software filled a gap that Ashcroft Logistics had been working around for 3 years, and their existing customer base in the medical supply chain was exactly the footprint Nathan wanted to expand into. He'd been working toward this deal for 8 months. The board was behind it. The numbers worked. He sat in the conference room on a Wednesday morning looking at the term sheet and found himself thinking about what Lena had said. You've been corporate for a long time and you're tired of it. He'd dismissed it at the time, or hadn't dismissed it exactly, but had filed it with the other accurate things people said that he didn't know what to do with. He wasn't tired of the work. He was good at the work, genuinely, and there was still something in him that found the problem-solving satisfying, The moment when a deal or a structural reorganization clicked into place the way a door fits right in its frame when you've gotten the hinges level. But she'd said it, not the work. He'd been corporate for a long time and was tired of it. The performance of it, the maintenance of the image, the constant management of how he was seen, steady, authoritative, reliable, never rattled, never uncertain, the man who had lost his wife and raised his daughter and built the company in the same years all at once, without visibly fracturing. The effort required to present that seamlessly had become something he barely noticed anymore, the way you stop noticing the weight of something you've been carrying for long enough. He signed the term sheet. He was good at the work. That was true. The rest he could think about some other time. Some other time never came, because it never does. In March, Marcus appeared in his office doorway on a Thursday afternoon with his tablet and an expression that Nathan had learned over 7 years of working together to read as something you need to see and probably won't like. "What?" Nathan said. Marcus came in, closed the door, and set the tablet on the desk facing Nathan. On the screen was a financial blog, one of the mid-tier business media sites that survived by being faster with information than it was careful with verification. The headline read, "Ashcroft Logistics, CEO's Mountain Mystery. Who Sheltered the Billionaire?" Nathan read the article in under 2 minutes. It was thin. Details of the crash, confirmation of his emergency declaration, his public statement from January. But someone, it wasn't clear who, possibly a search and rescue team member, possibly someone at the county sheriff's office, had given the journalist the name of the location where Nathan had been found. And the journalist had found Lena Brooks. There wasn't much. A photograph of the cabin from what appeared to be a county records image. Lena's name. A brief mention that she was a resident of the area living alone. The journalist had clearly tried to reach her for comment and gotten nothing, because the article ended with the phrase "Brooks did not respond to requests for comment," which Nathan suspected meant Lena had hung up a phone. If she had a phone. The article had been up for 6 hours. It had been picked up by 2 larger financial publications. The comment section was the usual, some speculative, some admiring, one person who had already decided this was a romantic story and said so at length. "Has anyone reached her?" Nathan asked. "There's a reporter from the Denver Post who drove out there this morning. She turned them away at the door." Nathan set the tablet down. "Okay." "Nathan, if this becomes a bigger story, and it could, if the bigger outlets decide it's a slow week and they want human interest." "I know. There are things we can do to manage it." "I know." He looked out the window. His office was on the 24th floor, and in March the view over Hartford was still gray-brown, the last of winter clinging to the trees. "Don't do anything yet. Let me think about it." Marcus picked up his tablet. At the door he stopped. "For what it's worth, you've never told me what actually happened up there. 2 days. Before the rescue." "I know." "You don't have to. I'm just noting that I've noticed." "I noticed you noticing," Nathan said. Marcus left. Nathan sat for a long time in his chair looking at the gray city outside and thinking about a woman who had turned a Denver Post reporter away from her door in the middle of winter in a cabin at the end of a ridge road. He thought about what that cost her, not financially, but in terms of the conversation that reporter would have forced on her, the intrusion of something she hadn't asked for and hadn't sought. He thought about how she'd gotten into this. She'd opened her door to a bleeding stranger because leaving him in the snow was not something she was built to do. She'd been generous with what she had, which wasn't much, and asked for nothing, and now the story was attached to her name. Because of him. He wasn't naive enough to think he could make that disappear, but he could, at minimum, not make it worse. He picked up his phone and called his PR director. "Nothing proactive, but," he said when she answered. "We don't confirm details. We don't add to the story. We don't reach out to Ms. Brooks for any coordinated statement. If the story dies on its own, we let it. And if it doesn't die on its own, then we handle it when it doesn't, not before." He hung up and went back to the Meredith term sheet. He was very good at the work. The story didn't die immediately, but it didn't grow either. It surfaced for 2 weeks in the mid-tier business press and generated a few gentle features of the Billionaire in the Blizzard variety, none of which had anything of substance in them because no one involved was talking. Nathan's team gave a brief statement emphasizing Nathan's gratitude to local first responders and the community and said nothing else. Lena apparently continued to hang up phones. By early April, it had faded. Nathan signed the Meredith acquisition on April 3rd. The board was pleased. The company's stock was up 6% since the beginning of the year. The integration plan was ahead of schedule, and at the quarterly leadership dinner, his CFO made a toast that included the line to our founder, who survived a plane crash and came back sharper than ever, and everyone laughed because in that room, in those circumstances, it was the appropriate thing to do. Nathan laughed too. He was very good at the performance of the appropriate thing. He flew home that night, commercially, per the board's new travel protocol, and Sophie was asleep when he got in, and he went to her room and stood in the doorway the way he always did, watching her sleep, the hall light casting its yellow rectangle across the floor the way she liked it. She'd kicked off one sock in her sleep, as she invariably did. Her stuffed animal, a beluga whale named Frank, the name being Sophie's idea, non-negotiable, was clutched against her chest. He stood there for a while. The house was quiet. It was a good house, well-built, well-heated, the right size for 2 people. He'd bought it when Sophie was 1, 2 years after losing Emily, because the apartment in the city had become unbearable, and Sophie needed a yard. He'd chosen it methodically, the way he chose everything: square footage, school district, distance from his office, structural soundness. He'd never chosen a house for how it felt to walk through the rooms at night, because he'd assumed that was a secondary thing, a thing that followed from the primary metrics. The cabin felt different at night, he thought. Not better necessarily, just different. Smaller, warmer in a way that wasn't just temperature. The kind of small that didn't make you feel confined. The kind that made you feel held was the wrong word. Located, like you knew where you were. He went to his own room. He did not fall asleep quickly. He was thinking about what Marcus had said. "You've never told me what actually happened up there." True. He hadn't told anyone, and not because there was anything to hide, or not because of that alone. Because what had happened up there was the 2 days, just the days themselves, the particularity of them. And he wasn't sure he could describe that to another person without losing what it was. Every conversation he'd had in the past 2 months had been subject to the translation problem. Things that made sense at that table in the candlelight did not necessarily translate to the boardroom, or the dinner table, or the house at midnight. Or rather, they translated too well. That was the actual problem. He understood very clearly now what had been missing from his life in a way he'd managed not to understand before. Before the crash, it had been an abstraction, a vague sense of absence, something he could attribute to grief or to the weight of responsibility and leave there. Now it was specific. It had a voice and a direct look and a particular way of saying exactly what it meant. He lay in the dark and thought, "She doesn't know who I am." Not the detail of it. She knew his name. She could have looked him up, probably had by now given that his name had been in the news attached to her address. But she didn't know who he was in the way that mattered in his actual life. The CEO, the billionaire, the man whose company employed 2,000 people and managed supply chains worth billions and sat on the board of 2 nonprofits and had an annual profile in the Hartford Business Journal. She'd known Nathan. A man with a bad knee and a worse bread loaf, and a daughter he lit up when talking about. A man who could learn to split wood if someone showed him the right way. She'd seen something real. Or he'd shown something real, in the way you can when the stakes are different. When the person across from you has no investment in the image you normally project. When you have nothing to manage. He hadn't told her. He'd said corporate and technology and logistics and hoped she wouldn't ask more. And she hadn't. But she would know now. She must know now, with her name connected to his in the press. He didn't know what she would think of that. He suspected he knew. He suspected because he knew her well enough. And it had only been 2 days, but some people you know in 2 days better than others, you know in 20 years. That she would think he had let her believe something false. That it would feel like a betrayal of the particular honesty of those 2 days. He didn't sleep. At 2 a.m, he got up, went to his desk, and opened his laptop. He did not search for her name. He sat for a few minutes and then he closed the laptop. He thought about the woman at the tree line, watching him walk away into the pines, and how he hadn't looked back until the last moment, and how when he did, she was still standing there exactly as he'd left her, and what her face had looked like in that moment was something he still couldn't read, even in memory. He went back to bed. He lay in the dark. Outside his window, the Connecticut spring was beginning. The trees barely budded, the ground still cold. Nothing like a mountain in the snow. Nothing like amber light through a window in a storm. He had told her his real name. He had not told her what his name meant in the world. He had told himself this was privacy, discretion, a reasonable choice made in extraordinary circumstances. In the dark at 2 a.m, he had the honesty to consider that it might also have been something more self-serving than that he'd wanted, very badly, to be seen without the weight of what he was. That he'd taken 2 days of being just Nathan, and he'd taken them by leaving her without the information she'd needed to make an informed choice about who she was talking to. He could live with a lot of things. He had lived with a lot of things. He lay awake until 4, which was unusual for him. And when he finally slept, it was not the deep, clean sleep of the cabin, but the familiar half-rest of a man whose mind keeps working even when he tells it to stop. It was a Monday in late April when the electricity came back on in the cabin. Nathan didn't know it was a Monday in late April when the electricity came back on. He didn't know it happened. He was in Hartford in a meeting about the Meredith integration timeline when a woman he hadn't spoken to since January plugged in her phone charger for the first time in months, and her voicemail loaded and the messages came through, all of them, everything that had been waiting in that suspended state between when the power went out and when it came back. Lena listened to them standing in her kitchen, one hand on the counter, while the afternoon light came through the window. She hadn't known Nathan had fixed the gap around until the winter passed, and she realized she couldn't feel the cold coming through it anymore. She listened to the first message. A woman's voice. Professional, clipped. This is a message for Mr. Ashcroft from the Ashcroft Logistics corporate office. Please call Claire Huang at your earliest. She listened to the second. Marcus, flat and controlled, but underneath it frightened. Nathan, we've got the helicopter standing by. The board is asking questions, and I don't have answers. The FAA is... She listened to 5 messages. She stopped after 5. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then she went to her laptop, the one she used for ordering supplies online and for the occasional freelance copywriting job that helped her make ends meet. And she typed Nathan Ashcroft into the search bar. She did not have to scroll far. The photograph that came up first was a business press headshot, formal, dark suit, the kind of image that projects authority and control. He looked like himself, but a version of himself that had been trimmed and pressed and aimed at a specific purpose. The jaw was the same. The eyes were the same. Nathan Ashcroft, CEO and founder of Ashcroft Logistics, one of North America's largest supply chain management corporations, with revenues exceeding... She closed the laptop. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard, the cleared wood, the repaired shutter on the east-facing wall, the door that didn't let cold air across the floor anymore. She thought about a man who'd said, "I run a company," in the most deliberately unremarkable voice she'd ever heard, who'd asked to borrow tools as though he wasn't sure he was allowed, who'd eaten geological bread with butter and seemed genuinely, uncomplicatedly satisfied with it. She thought about the way he'd talked about Sophie. She thought about the last morning, him at the window with 2 mugs of coffee, having made enough for her without being asked. She thought about all of it, this quick succession of specific images, and underneath them was a feeling that she was going to have to sit with for a while before it became something she knew what to do with. It wasn't simple anger, it wasn't simple anything. It was the feeling of having trusted the truth of something and then having the ground shift under it. Not collapse, but shift. Enough to make you wonder what you'd actually been standing on. She stood at the window until the light changed. Then she did what she always did when something was too large to process standing still. She went outside. She picked up the axe. She split wood until her arms shook, and then she stopped and sat down on the log pile in the cold afternoon, and she thought about a man who had learned to split wood wrong and then let her show him the right way, who had looked, genuinely, unmistakably grateful for the correction, who had taken the instruction with both hands, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like being corrected about something didn't threaten anything about him. She had met a lot of people in her 30 years. She had met very few people who could do that. It didn't fix anything. It didn't explain anything. But it sat in the stack of evidence she was building, and she was honest enough with herself to count it. She went back inside. She did not look at the laptop again. She heated water for tea and she sat in the armchair by the stove, her father's armchair, worn thin on the right armrest where he'd rested his elbow for 20 years. And she thought, quietly and without arriving anywhere in particular, about what it meant to know someone for 2 days. Whether 2 days could be enough to know something true. Whether a man could be honest about the things that mattered and still withhold something this large. And whether those two things could coexist in the same person without one of them canceling the other out. She didn't have an answer. The stove ticked. Outside, the snow was beginning to melt in earnest now, the mountain releasing it slowly, water running in thin, bright lines through the yard, carving the same paths it carved every spring. The world was becoming something different from what it had been in January. Not better or worse. Different. The way things always are, after enough time. Lena held her mug and sat in her father's chair and felt the anger and the something underneath the anger, which was more complicated and more inconvenient than the anger, and she let both of them be there. She didn't pick up the phone. She didn't need to. Not yet. She would need to figure out what she wanted to say before she said anything. That was how she'd always worked, slowly, honestly, without rushing toward resolution. Her father had taught her that. Wait until you know what you mean, he'd said, about any number of things. Then say it. She knew what she felt. She didn't yet know what she meant. She waited. She called him on a Wednesday. Nathan was in the middle of a conference call when his cell phone lit up on the desk beside him. An unfamiliar number, Colorado area code, and something in his chest recognized it before his brain had fully processed it. He held up one finger to the room, muted himself on the conference line, and answered. Nathan Ashcroft. A pause. One beat, maybe two. You have people who answer your phone, Lena said. Her voice was exactly as he remembered it. Flat, direct, no performance in it. He stood up and walked to the window, turning his back to the conference room table, where 3 of his directors were watching him with the carefully neutral expressions of people pretending not to watch. I also answer it myself sometimes, he said. Lena. The electricity came back on, she said. I got the voicemails. I know, I assumed you would eventually. I looked you up. I know that too. Another pause, longer this time. He could hear faintly wind against whatever window she was standing at. He thought about the kitchen window and the gap he'd packed and whether the cold still came through on the worst days. He did not say any of this. You said you run a company, she said. I do run a company. Nathan. The way she said his name now was different from before. Not cold exactly, but precise, like she was placing it down carefully on a surface. Your company has revenues of $4 billion annually. You have 2,000 employees. You are on the cover of the Hartford Business Journal every spring. There is a Wikipedia page about you. I know. Then you know what I mean when I say that I run a company is not a complete answer. It's not a false one. I didn't say it was false. He heard her move, a footstep, the faint sound of her sitting down, the creak of something wooden. Her father's chair, maybe. I said it wasn't complete. He said nothing. Why? She said. Why didn't you tell me? He had thought about this question for 3 months. He had prepared several answers, not consciously, but the way you prepare things by turning them over enough times that they take a shape. None of the prepared answers came to him now. What came instead was the truth, which was less polished and more uncomfortable. Because you opened the door and saw a person, he said, and I didn't want to watch that change. The silence on the other end had a quality to it that he couldn't read from this distance. He waited. That's honest, she said finally. Yes. It's also something you decided for me, she said. You took the choice away from me. Whether I wanted to know who I was letting into my house. That's not nothing, Nathan. No, he said. It's not. I want you to know something. Her voice was steady, and he could hear the effort of keeping it that way. The particular control of someone who has decided to say a difficult thing and is going to say it without flinching. Those 2 days, what happened in that cabin, the conversations we had, I don't take that back. I don't think it was false, but I also don't know what it was now. I don't know which parts of it were real and which parts were you, performing some version of yourself you wanted to be. All of it was real, he said immediately. You can't know that, she said. People can't always see their own performance. That's the whole problem with performing. He had no answer for that because she was right. He stood at the window of his 24th floor office and looked at the April city below and felt the full weight of what he'd withheld and what it had cost. I'm sorry, he said. I know you are. She paused. I can tell. It doesn't fix it. No, it doesn't. Another pause. Longer. I need to not talk to you for a while, she said. I need to think about this without your voice in my ear while I'm doing it. That's fair. Don't call me. Don't send someone to check on me. I know that's the kind of thing you do. Send people. Don't. A breath. If I want to talk to you again, I'll tell you. Okay, he said. She hung up. He stood at the window for a long time after. Behind him, the conference call was presumably still going. He didn't go back to it. He just stood there with the phone in his hand and looked at the city and thought about what she'd said. Which parts of it were real and which parts were you performing some version of yourself you wanted to be? And the honest answer was that he didn't know. He wanted to believe it was all real. He believed that he believed it. But she was right that belief and accuracy were not the same thing when it came to the way a person presented themselves. He had been performing Nathan Ashcroft, professional, competent, contained, for so long that he no longer had reliable access to where the performance ended, except in the cabin. In those 2 days. He had not been performing in the cabin, but he'd taken those 2 days under false pretenses, which meant even the real thing had a false bottom. He put the phone in his pocket. He went back to the conference table. He said, "Sorry about that," and picked up where they'd left off and nobody asked, and he answered every question with precision and clarity. And the conversation moved forward the way conversations in conference rooms do, toward the next thing and the next thing, because that was the nature of those rooms. May passed. It was a productive month by any measure Nathan applied to his months. The Meredith integration hit its milestones. The supply chain software they'd acquired was already being deployed to 3 of Ashcroft Logistics' existing clients, and early feedback was better than the projections. He hired a new VP of technology, a woman named Riza, who'd come from one of the big West Coast firms, and who had the particular combination of technical depth and interpersonal intelligence that Nathan looked for in people. He settled 2 minor legal disputes, approved the Q2 budget, and gave a keynote address at a logistics industry conference in Chicago that his communications director called the best public address he'd delivered in 4 years. At home, Sophie finished kindergarten. She brought home a drawing of her family that she'd made for the end-of-year showcase. Nathan, herself, a large crayon beluga whale that was apparently Frank's official portrait, and a figure to the right that was slightly separate from the main grouping. He asked about the figure, and Sophie said it was a woman with dark hair, and Nathan said, "Who is it?" And Sophie said with absolute confidence, "The bread lady," and then moved on to talk about something else, while Nathan stood in the school gymnasium holding a crayon drawing of his family and feeling like the floor had slightly tilted under him. He had not told Sophie about the cabin beyond the basic facts. Plane trouble, a kind neighbor, all fine. Sophie had asked twice about the bread lady, apparently having caught some fragment of conversation she wasn't supposed to, and Nathan had deflected both times. He had not understood until this moment that Sophie, with the unconscious accuracy that 6-year-olds have about emotional weather, had concluded something he hadn't stated. He brought the drawing home and put it on the refrigerator. He stood and looked at it. He thought about calling Marcus. He thought about pouring a drink. He thought about the board meeting next Thursday and the integration timeline and the 17 emails that needed responses tonight. Instead, he went to Sophie's room and found her on the floor arranging a fleet of small plastic sea animals in what appeared to be a complex social hierarchy. He sat down on the floor beside her without asking, and she handed him a hammerhead shark without looking up, indicating where he should put it in the arrangement. He put it where she pointed. They sat on the floor together for 40 minutes, organizing and reorganizing the ocean, and he did not think about anything else. June came in hot and dry. Nathan had been in 3 cities in 10 days and was home for what he intended to be a full week when Marcus appeared in his office on a Tuesday morning with his tablet and an expression that Nathan recognized as the other kind. Not something you won't like, but something that requires a decision you're not going to want to make. The board met Sunday, Marcus said. Nathan looked up from the document he'd been reading. I know they met Sunday. It was a scheduled check-in. There was additional discussion, off agenda. Nathan set down the document. About what? Marcus put the tablet on the desk. There was a memo on the screen. Formal, from the board chair, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who'd been on Nathan's board since year 3, and who Nathan respected for his directness, even when the directness was inconvenient. Nathan read it. It was a proposal. Framed as a proposal in the careful language of board governance, but the architecture of it was clear, a suggestion that Nathan consider transitioning from CEO to an executive chairman role over the following 18 months. Operational management to be handed to a new CEO designate to be jointly selected. Nathan to retain strategic oversight, brand relationship, and board seat. They were asking him to step back. He read it twice. Then he looked at Marcus. How long has this been being discussed? He said. The airplane thing started it, Marcus said, with the straightforwardness that Nathan had always valued and occasionally wanted to throw out a window. The 2-day gap in communications during the Meredith negotiation. Whitmore raised it as a question about continuity planning. It evolved into a transition proposal. Marcus paused. For what it's worth, they're not wrong about the underlying issue. The company has grown past the point where a single person can hold all the key relationships and all the operational controls simultaneously. You know this. I know you know this. I know it. Then you know the question isn't whether this transition happens. It's when and how. Nathan sat back in his chair. He looked at the memo and then looked out the window at the June city, green now, the trees full. He thought about the 2-day gap Marcus had mentioned. His 2 days on a mountain, splitting wood and eating bean soup and having conversations that felt more like real life than anything that had happened to him in years. And he thought about the fact that those 2 days had triggered a board governance discussion that was now sitting on his desk as a formal memo. I need time to think about this, he said. You have until the July board meeting, Marcus said. That's 5 weeks. After Marcus left, Nathan sat alone for a long time. He had built this company over 15 years, from a regional freight brokerage with 8 employees to the current structure, and the building of it had been the project of his adult life, alongside and sometimes entangled with the project of raising Sophie, and the project of surviving the loss of Emily, and the project of being, by some definition, a whole person. The company was not separate from him. It had been built out of him, out of choices that were also choices about who he was. And now the board was telling him, gently, in the language of governance memos, that the company had outgrown the structure of one person holding it all, that what he'd built was bigger than him now. He didn't know how he felt about that. He was supposed to feel pride, he thought, and he did, somewhere. But underneath it was something that felt more like looking at a door you'd built and realizing it had stopped being yours the moment it became part of the house. He picked up his phone. He almost called Lena. He hadn't called her since April. She'd asked him not to, and he hadn't, but he wanted to. He wanted to call her and tell her about the memo and hear what she'd say, because she was one of the only people in his life who wasn't inside the system, who wasn't invested in any particular outcome, who would simply think about it and say what she thought. He put the phone down. He had made her a promise. He kept his promises, or he tried to. He put the phone in his desk drawer and went back to work. He didn't sleep well in June, not catastrophically. He functioned. He was sharp in meetings. He gave the board a measured and thoughtful response to the succession memo that earned him a conversation with Whitmore that both of them considered useful. But he woke most nights between 2 and 4 a.m. and lay in the dark thinking about things he'd been too busy to think about during the day. He thought about the company. He thought about Sophie, who was in the gap between kindergarten ending and summer camp beginning, and who had taken to spending her mornings in the backyard with a bucket of water and an elaborate scheme involving the bird bath that Nathan didn't fully understand but had decided to encourage. He thought about what the company would look like with someone else running the day-to-day, whether he could release that control or whether it would feel like watching someone else drive his car. He thought about Lena. He thought about the phone call in April and the sentence she'd said that he kept returning to, "I don't know which parts of it were real and which parts were you performing some version of yourself you wanted to be." He'd been sitting with that for 2 months, and he'd come to a conclusion slowly through the specific kind of examination that happens at 3 in the morning when there's no one to perform for. The parts that were real, all of it. The exhaustion under the calm, the genuine satisfaction of splitting wood correctly, the stories about Sophie, the feeling of being seen without the apparatus. All real. The parts that were performance, the omission, the deliberate shaping of the picture, the choice, made in the moment at the kitchen table and maintained for 2 full days, not to say I run a company that employs 2,000 people and has a Wikipedia page. She hadn't asked him to be perfect. She'd asked him to be honest. And he'd been honest about everything except the one thing that would have changed how she saw him. And he told himself that was discretion. And at 3 in the morning in June, with the house quiet around him, he had to admit that discretion and self-interest had occupied the same space, and he wasn't sure anymore which one had actually been driving. He sat up. He turned on the lamp. He found a legal pad on the nightstand. There was always a legal pad on the nightstand. The occupation never truly stopped. And he sat in his bed at 3 in the morning and he started writing. Not a business document, not a memo. A letter. He hadn't written a personal letter in, he tried to think, years. Everything was email, text, voice. The deliberate act of writing by hand on paper was so foreign that his handwriting came out awkward at first, cramped and uneven, like someone who's been typing for a decade trying to remember how to hold a pen. He let it be awkward. He kept going. He wrote about the crash first, not the version in his official statement, but the real version, the 45 seconds of calm before he understood the engine wasn't coming back, the feeling of the lake coming up at 90 knots, the name he'd said out loud before the wheels hit the ice. He wrote about walking through the blizzard with the flashlight and the 2 emergency blankets and the bad knee getting worse with every step. He wrote about the moment her door opened. He wrote about the bread and the axe and the door hinge and the conversation in the candlelight. He wrote about what those 2 days had felt like to a man who had been performing competence and grief and single fatherhood and corporate authority simultaneously for 3 years without stopping, without rest, without anyone in his life who was outside the system of his life and could see him without investment in the outcome. He wrote about why he hadn't told her who he was. The whole truth of it, the uncomfortable part, that he'd wanted to be someone she saw as a person, not as a category, that he'd taken that, knowing it wasn't entirely his to take, that he'd understood even in the moment that the choice had edges he wasn't fully examining. He wrote about Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator. The bread lady, slightly separate from the main group, drawn in the careful crayon hand of a 6-year-old who noticed everything. He wrote for an hour and a half, the legal pad filled up on both sides, and he started a second sheet. He was not editing. He was not managing this for an audience. He wrote the way he'd talked at the kitchen table in the candlelight, because there was no one there to perform for, or because the person he was performing for had already seen past it, or because somewhere between falling asleep and waking at 2 a.m., he'd stopped being able to maintain the separation. When he was done, he read it back. It was messy, and in places unclear, and the handwriting was still uneven. It was also, he thought, honest. The most honest thing he'd written with his hand since he was 19, and wrote Emily a letter on a piece of loose leaf in the library because he hadn't known how to say it to her face. He folded the pages. He didn't have an envelope. He found one in the desk in his study, a plain white one, and he addressed it. He put a stamp on it. Then he sat at the desk and looked at the envelope and did not mail it yet. There was something else, something that had been forming in the background for weeks since the board memo, since the night he'd almost called Lena and put the phone in the drawer. Something that had started as a feeling and was gradually becoming a thought, and was now becoming, in the 3 a.m. clarity of an honest month, something that resembled a decision. He opened his laptop. He found the contact for his legal team, specifically Daniel Reeves, his corporate attorney, The man who'd structured every major company transaction for the past 8 years. He wrote Daniel an email, short and clear, requesting a meeting the following morning. He described in 3 sentences what he wanted to discuss. He sent the email. He put the laptop away. He went back to bed with the letter on the nightstand. He slept. The meeting with Daniel Reeves was at 8 a.m. and ran until nearly noon. Daniel was a thin, precise man in his early 60s who wore wire-rimmed glasses and had the quality of someone who had heard every variety of human decision in a legal context and was genuinely surprised by almost none of it. Nathan had watched him absorb major corporate news, personal disclosures, and the occasional genuine catastrophe with the same measured receptivity. He sat across from Nathan with a yellow legal pad of his own and listened to what Nathan was proposing without interrupting. When Nathan finished, Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Let me make sure I have this right," he said. "Please. You want to create an independent trust. Let's call it the Ashcroft Operational Trust for now. You would transfer voting control of the company into this trust. The trust would be governed by a 3-member independent board, none of whom can be you or anyone on your current payroll. The trust would hold operational authority. You would retain economic interest, the value of your shares, but the decision-making power of those shares goes to the trust." "Correct." Daniel wrote something on his pad. "And you want this done? When?" "Before the July board meeting." Daniel looked up. "Nathan, that's 3 weeks." "I know." "The legal work alone, I know it's aggressive. I need to know if it's possible." Daniel set his pen down. He looked at Nathan with the particular look of someone who has been asked to do something unusual and is deciding whether to ask the obvious question or simply proceed to the logistics. "This is not," he said carefully, "a typical response to a board succession memo." "No," Nathan agreed. "The board is asking you to consider a transition over 18 months. I'm proposing to remove myself from operational control voluntarily and immediately, without being asked to." He paused. "The board isn't making me do this. This isn't reactive." "Then what is it?" Nathan thought about the letter on his nightstand. He thought about the phone he hadn't called. He thought about the thing he'd been trying to prove, and who he'd been trying to prove it to, and whether there was any version of proof that worked from this distance. "I've been running this company for 15 years, he said. "I built it. I know every corner of it, and I have spent 3 years since my wife died using it as the thing I hold on to when everything else feels unstable. It has served as a reason not to look at other things." He paused. "That's not fair to the company, and it's not fair to Sophie, and it's not fair to the person I've been trying to become." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. "There are other ways to create separation. You could take a leave of absence. You could accelerate the board's transition plan." "I could," Nathan said. "Those are all reversible. I need something that isn't reversible." "Why?" "Because reversible doesn't mean anything," Nathan said. "It means I'm leaving a door open. I need to close the door." Another silence. "Is this about a woman?" Daniel asked, with the tone of a man who has learned to ask direct questions because the indirect ones waste everyone's time. Nathan looked at him. "Why would it matter if it were?" "It wouldn't change the legality," Daniel said. "It would change whether I recommend you sleep on this for another month." "I've been sleeping on it since January," Nathan said. "I'm done sleeping on it." Daniel picked up his pen. He wrote something. He wrote several more things. He turned the pad around so Nathan could see the structure he'd sketched: the trust entity, the governance board, the transfer mechanism, the preservation of economic interest. It was rough. It was also clearly the work of a man who knew how to do this. 3 weeks is tight," Daniel said. "I'll need everything from you immediately. I'll need your cooperation on the valuation documentation, the trust charter, and the board disclosure. There will be SEC filings. There will be questions. I can handle questions. You'll need to disclose this to your board before it's executed." "I know." "Whitmore's going to think you've lost your mind." "Possibly," Nathan said. "That's all right." Daniel looked at him over his glasses. Something in the older man's expression shifted, not softened exactly, more like recalibrated. The look of someone encountering something he's seen rarely enough that it still registers as unusual. "You're serious," Daniel said. "I'm serious." Daniel nodded. He turned the pad back around. He started writing. "Let me make some calls," he said. "I'll have a preliminary structure to you by Friday." Lasang. He called the board chair that afternoon. Whitmore picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been expecting the call, which meant Marcus had probably said something, which Nathan noted without irritation. "Gerald," Nathan said, "I want to talk to you about the succession memo." "I figured," Whitmore said. He had a deep voice and a Florida retirement home ease in his speech patterns that didn't at all reflect the sharpness underneath. "I want you to know that memo was not an ultimatum. It was a conversation starter." "I know it was." Nathan leaned back in his desk chair. "I'm starting the conversation. Here's where I am." He laid it out. The trust structure. The timeline. His intention to retain economic interest in a board seat, but to transfer operational voting control. He spoke for about 4 minutes and then stopped. Whitmore was quiet. "Say what you're thinking," Nathan said. "I'm thinking," Whitmore said slowly, "that the memo asked you to consider a managed transition over 18 months, and you've come back with something that looks a lot like you giving away the wheel while the car is still moving." "The car is in good condition," Nathan said. "Good team, good trajectory. Marcus can manage the operational day-to-day while the trust convenes and begins the CEO search. The Meredith integration is on track. There's no better time to do this than now." "That may be true from a business standpoint," Whitmore said. "I'm asking about you." "What about me?" "Nathan, in 15 years I have never once seen you make a move that wasn't strategic, calculated. Every decision has angles you've already worked out." A pause. "This doesn't feel like that." "Maybe it doesn't need to be," Nathan said. Whitmore was quiet again. Nathan waited. "Is this about that woman?" Whitmore said. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. "Gerald? I'm not being prurient, I'm being direct." "It's about a lot of things," Nathan said. "One of them is a woman. One of them is my daughter. One of them is 15 years of holding a thing so tightly I've lost the feeling in my hands." He paused. "I'm not having a breakdown. I'm not making an impulsive decision. I have looked at this from every angle I know how to look from, and this is where I land." A long silence. "The trust needs good people on it," Whitmore said finally. "I have a list. I'll send it to you today. And the CEO search. You want input?" "I want to be part of the conversation, not the deciding vote." "That's going to be strange for you." "Yes," Nathan said. "Probably." Whitmore made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that neighborhood. "Send me the list," he said. "I'll talk to the other board members. No promises." "I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for an honest conversation." "All right," Whitmore said. "All right." They rang off. Nathan sat in his chair and pressed his thumbs against his temples and breathed. Outside, it was a Tuesday in June. The city below was going about its business in the way cities do, indifferent to the decisions being made in any given office on any given floor. He opened his desk drawer. He took out the letter. He read it once more, all the way through. His handwriting was still uneven. The thoughts were still messy in places. There was a paragraph in the middle about Sophie's drawing that he considered cutting and then left because the letter was supposed to be true, and that was true. He found another envelope. He copied the address from the first one. He sealed it. He would send it tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow, after he'd had one more night with it. Not to reconsider. He was past reconsidering. But because some things deserved to be slept on once more, just to be sure. He put the letter in his jacket pocket, and he left the office at 4 in the afternoon, which was something he hadn't done in months. And he drove home and found Sophie in the backyard with her bird bath and her bucket and a serious expression, and he sat on the back step and watched her work. And she narrated her project to him in the patient, detailed way she narrated all her projects, and he listened. All of it. Every word. What? He signed the trust documents on a Friday morning, 3.5 weeks after his meeting with Daniel Reeves, which meant Daniel had moved faster than he'd promised, which meant Daniel thought this was the right thing to do even if he hadn't said so. The documents were 37 pages. Nathan had read every page twice. He signed where he was directed, each signature the same Nathan Ashcroft he'd written on contracts and deals, and the articles of incorporation of the company itself 15 years ago, in a different office, a smaller room, with the particular handwriting of a man who didn't know yet what he was building. When it was done, Daniel shook his hand and said formally, "Congratulations," or condolences, I'm not sure which. "Neither am I," Nathan said. He drove home. Sophie was at a friend's birthday party and wouldn't be back until 4. The house was empty in the particular way it was when Sophie wasn't in it. The rooms were fine rooms. They were clean and warm and had all the right things in them, but they were quieter than they should have been, a background hum missing. He went to his desk. He opened the drawer. The letter was there, where it had been for 3 weeks, waiting. He picked it up. He added 3 paragraphs to the bottom of the last page, in the same uneven handwriting. The first paragraph described the trust, not defensively, not as an argument for himself, just as a fact, stated plainly. "I signed control of the company into an independent trust this morning. I am no longer the operational authority of Ashcroft Logistics." The second paragraph was an acknowledgement. "I'm not telling you this to prove anything or to ask for anything. I'm telling you because the letter is supposed to be true, and this happened, and it's part of the truth." The third paragraph was the one he'd been trying to write for 6 months. "I know that 2 days doesn't give me the right to say most of what I want to say. I know you told me not to call you, and I haven't. I know the way I handled my identity was a failure of honesty at the exact moment honesty mattered most. I know all of this. What I also know is that in 42 years of being alive, I have never felt more like myself than I did in 2 days in a cabin in a snowstorm, talking to someone who had no investment in who I was supposed to be. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not asking you to tell me. I'm just saying it, because the letter is supposed to be true." He sealed the envelope. He drove to the post office himself, not the company courier, not the assistant. He stood in line behind a woman with a stroller and a teenager with a package, and a man in his 60s mailing what appeared to be several birthday cards. And when it was his turn, he handed the letter across the counter and watched the clerk drop it in the outgoing mail slot. Then he went home. He changed out of his suit. He was in jeans and a t-shirt, and he was standing in his kitchen making coffee. Real coffee. Ground beans, the way Lena had done it in the cabin, when Mrs. Ellison brought Sophie back from the party. Sophie came through the door still wearing a paper crown from the party activities and holding a balloon and talking at full volume about something involving a piñata, and Nathan crouched down and caught her and held on, her arms around his neck and the balloon bumping against the side of his head. "Did I miss good stuff?" he said. "So much good stuff," Sophie said. "There was a piñata shaped like a shark and I hit it 4 times and it fell apart and everyone got candy." 4 times? 4 times, she confirmed, with the solemnity of a person relating an important achievement. "That's my kid," Nathan said. She pulled back and looked at him with the frank, assessing look she'd inherited from somewhere. From Emily, he'd always thought, though sometimes he saw things in Sophie that he couldn't attribute to either of them, that seemed to be purely her own. She studied his face. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" She considered. "Like you put something down." He held very still for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I did." She accepted this and moved on to telling him about the cake, which had been chocolate with a blue frosting ocean on top, and he sat on the kitchen floor with her and listened, and the afternoon light came through the window, and the coffee he'd made sat on the counter going cold, and he did not mind any of it. Outside, somewhere in the mail system, a letter was moving westward. He didn't know if she'd respond. He didn't know if she'd even read it all the way through. He'd meant what he'd written at the end. He wasn't asking for anything. The sending was the thing, the honesty of it, the record of it, the act of putting the true version in an envelope and releasing it into the world without being able to manage what happened next. He'd spent 15 years managing what happened next. Maybe that was enough of that. Sophie was still talking about the shark piñata, about a girl named Iris who'd been at the party and who Sophie had decided was now her second best friend, about whether a beluga whale could beat a great white shark in an arm wrestling contest, which was a question Nathan was fairly certain no one had considered before, but which Sophie had apparently been thinking about for some time. He answered the shark question seriously because Sophie deserved serious answers, and she argued with his reasoning for 10 minutes, and he let her. And outside the afternoon was going somewhere neither of them needed to track. The letter was in the mail. That was all he'd done. All he could do. The rest was hers. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Lena knew it was from him before she opened it. She didn't know how she knew. The return address was a Hartford zip code with no name, and the handwriting on the envelope was uneven in a way that didn't match the controlled precision she'd have expected from a man who ran a billion-dollar company. Maybe that was exactly why she knew. The unevenness of it. The stamp slightly crooked. The envelope a plain white rectangle, the kind you buy in a box of 50 at a drugstore. Not the heavy cream-colored stationery she'd half expected from someone with his resources. She left it on the kitchen table for 2 hours before she opened it. She made bread in that time. Not because she needed bread, she had half a loaf from yesterday, but because bread required her hands and her attention and kept the other part of her brain quiet. She'd learned that about herself in the past year, that certain physical tasks created enough occupation that the part of her that ran in anxious loops couldn't get enough traction to take over. Her father had called it keeping your hands honest. She'd understood him better since living alone. The bread was proofing under a cloth on the counter when she finally sat down at the table and picked up the envelope. She opened it carefully, not tearing, working her finger under the flap the way her father had always opened letters, as though the envelope itself might be worth keeping. Inside were several sheets of a yellow legal pad, covered on both sides in handwriting that started cramped and uncertain at the top of the first page and gradually loosened as it went, like someone finding their gait. She read it straight through without stopping. Then she sat with it. Outside, the July mountain was doing what it did in summer, the aspens moving in the afternoon wind. The sky, that particular deep Colorado blue that only exists above 8,000 feet. A hawk was doing slow circles over the meadow at the lake's edge. The cabin was warm and quiet. She read the letter again. Slower this time. The first time through, she'd been looking for the thing that would tell her what she already suspected. The justification, the carefully worded explanation that was really an argument for why he'd done nothing wrong. The kind of letter a man with lawyers writes when he wants to appear sincere. She'd been ready for it. She'd had her defenses arranged. She didn't find it. What she found instead was a man sitting in the dark at 3 a.m, writing in handwriting that started bad and stayed imperfect, telling the truth in the particular clumsy way of someone who isn't used to having to find words for things they've only felt. He wrote about the crash the way people describe things they survived and haven't fully processed, fast, almost detached, then suddenly specific in a way that gave it away. He wrote about walking through the blizzard and the feeling of the flashlight getting dimmer and the moment the cabin window appeared through the trees. He wrote about her father's tools. She hadn't expected that. She'd told him that story, the tools she hadn't been able to touch, the admission that going into that kit felt like accepting her father wasn't coming back, and she'd said it in the way she said most things, neutrally, matter-of-factly, because the alternative was to make it a bigger thing than she could afford to make it. She'd thought he'd absorbed it the way most people absorbed things like that. A polite acknowledgement, and then the conversation moves on. He hadn't moved on. He'd been thinking about it. He'd written about it in the letter, carefully, the way someone handles something they understand to be fragile. You said you weren't ready to be the person in that cabin who fixed things. I think you were ready. I think you'd been ready for a while and were just waiting for the right moment. The moment came, and you let it. That says something about you that I've been thinking about since January. She put the letter down. She picked it up again. The part about why he hadn't told her, but she read that 3 times. Not because it was unclear, because it was the part that had the most weight in it, and she wanted to be sure she was understanding it accurately and not interpreting it through what she wanted it to say. He hadn't written, I was afraid you'd treat me differently, which would have been the easy version, the sympathetic version, the one that placed the responsibility on her hypothetical reaction. He'd written, I wanted to be seen as a person, and I took that by leaving out the information you needed to make an informed choice. I told myself it was discretion. At 3 a.m, it looks more like self-interest. Probably it was both, and I've been honest with myself enough to stop pretending I know exactly where one ended and the other began. She sat with that sentence for a long time. The bread needed to go in the oven. She got up, scored the top in the way he'd tried and failed to do correctly that second afternoon, and slid it in. She set the timer. She sat back down. The last 3 paragraphs. She read them standing up, which she didn't realize she was doing until she was halfway through, having stood without noticing. I signed control of the company into an independent trust this morning. I am no longer the operational authority of Ashcroft Logistics. She read that sentence 4 times. She looked at the date at the top of the letter. He dated it the day he signed, which meant he'd added these paragraphs the same day and mailed it immediately, which meant he hadn't sat on this, hadn't managed it, hadn't given himself time to reconsider. I'm not telling you this to prove anything or to ask for anything. She put the letter on the table. She went to the window and stood with her arms folded and looked at the mountain and the hawks still circling and the aspens moving in the afternoon. She stayed there until the timer went off. She took the bread out. She set it on the cooling rack. She did these things with her hands while her mind was somewhere else entirely, which was not ideal for bread, but not disastrous either. She thought about the phone call in April, the control in her own voice, the deliberate steadiness she'd maintained, the "I need to not talk to you for a while." She'd meant it. She'd needed the distance. She'd needed to think without his voice in her ear, without the particular quality of his attention, which was, she was honest with herself about this, because she'd had 3 months to be one of the more disorienting things she'd encountered. Most people's attention moved. It skimmed surfaces, jumped to the next thing, waited for its turn to talk. His stayed. It landed and it stayed, and it made you feel uncomfortably and accurately that you were being genuinely heard, which was a rarer experience than it should be. She'd needed to think without that. So she'd thought. For 3 months she'd thought, and what she'd come to was something she hadn't entirely expected. She wasn't angry at him for hiding his identity the way she'd initially thought she was. The anger had been real in the moment. The electricity coming back, the voicemails, his name in the search results attached to a photograph of a man in a dark suit who looked like himself in a way that was subtly and significantly different from the man who'd eaten geological bread at her kitchen table. That had landed hard. But underneath the anger, when she'd excavated it carefully, was something that was less about deception and more about disappointment. She'd had something for 2 days that had felt real, in a way that few things in her recent life had felt real. And when the lights came back on, the possibility had surfaced that it had been not false, but performed. That she'd been a pleasant interlude in a complicated man's complicated life, or a rest stop, a temporary simplicity. The letter said otherwise. Or the letter claimed otherwise, which was not the same thing, and she was not so far gone that she couldn't distinguish between the two. A man could write a convincing letter. A man with resources and intelligence and the lifetime skill of managing how he was perceived could absolutely construct a sincere-seeming document. But he hadn't constructed anything. That was the thing. The handwriting was bad. The structure wandered. There was a paragraph about Sophie's drawing that had nothing to do with explaining or justifying anything and everything to do with just telling her. Because it was true and he wanted her to know it, and he'd included it without apparent awareness that it was the most persuasive thing in the letter, which was exactly why it was the most persuasive thing in the letter. A man performing sincerity knows which details are doing the work. This man had written like someone who'd forgotten to manage the impression. She pulled a chair from the table. She sat down heavily. She thought about what it actually meant. The trust, the transfer of control, the thing he'd built for 15 years handed over to an independent structure that he no longer commanded. She thought about Whitmore's likely reaction, which she could imagine clearly even without knowing the man. "Nathan, have you lost your mind?" She thought about what it felt like to sign your name on something that couldn't be taken back. She knew something about that. She'd done something similar, though in the opposite direction and without ceremony, the day she'd loaded her car in Denver and driven west and not gone back. The moment you stop leaving yourself an exit. The particular feeling of it, which is terrifying and clarifying in almost equal measure. He'd done it. Not to get something from her. The letter was clear about that. He'd done it because he'd been holding the company the way she'd been unable to touch the tools. Not because he needed to, but because it was the thing he held when he didn't know what else to hold. And he'd put it down. She sat with all of this for a long time. The bread cooled on the rack. The hawk outside completed its circles and moved on. The afternoon light shifted, the way mountain light does in July, going from flat and white to something angled in gold. She picked up her phone. She didn't call him. She was not ready to call him. She wasn't sure what she would say, and she'd inherited her father's rule about saying things before you knew what you meant. She called her friend Darcy instead. Darcy was 43, a former high school art teacher who now ran a small pottery studio in a town 40 miles from Lena's cabin, and who had been Lena's closest and most reliable friend for 6 years, since the two of them had ended up stranded together in a broken-down shuttle bus during a winter storm and had spent 4 hours talking and decided, more or less mutually and out loud, that they were going to be friends. Darcy was loud and practical, and occasionally wrong in her assessments, but almost never dishonest, which Lena valued more than being always right. "Tell me what the letter said," Darcy said, when Lena had explained. Lena told her. Not verbatim. She paraphrased, summarized, caught the key things. Darcy listened without interrupting, which was not her usual mode and meant she was taking it seriously. When Lena finished, there was a brief silence. "The bread lady drawing," Darcy said. "I know. His 6-year-old put you in the family portrait." "I know, Darcy." "And he signed away his company. Transferred operational control. He still owns the economic—" "Lena, he gave up the wheel for a woman he spent 2 days with 6 months ago." "I'm aware of what happened." "Are you? Because you're describing it like you're reading from a case file." Lena looked at the letter on the table. "I don't know how else to describe it." "You describe it however it actually felt when you read it," Darcy said. "How did it actually feel?" A pause. The kind that happens when someone asks the question you've been avoiding by processing everything else. "Like something that happened to me," Lena said slowly. "Those 2 days. Like something that actually happened, not something I imagined or idealized. Like," she stopped, "like he was the same person in the letter as he was in the cabin, which is the thing I wasn't sure about." "Okay," Darcy said, "that doesn't mean it's simple." "Obviously not. Nothing about this is simple. He's a billionaire with a deceased wife and a 6-year-old and a company he just dismantled, and you live alone on a mountain and are barely making ends meet, and the last relationship you had ended because the guy was secretly seeing someone else for almost a year." Pause. "Sorry. I know you know all of this." "It's fine. What do you want, Lena? Not what makes sense. What do you want?" The question sat there, clean and direct and requiring an answer she hadn't let herself get near. "I want it to be simpler," Lena said. "It isn't. I know." "What do you want that's possible?" She looked out the window. The evening was coming on, the sky going from gold to orange at the edges, the mountains going from green to something darker, denser. "I want to see him," she said, "and I want to be honest with him about how angry I am, still, underneath everything else. And I want to see if what was real in January is still real now, when we both know the full picture." She paused. "And I want him to not expect that to fix anything immediately. I want him to understand that if he comes here expecting some kind of resolution, he's going to leave disappointed." "Tell him that," Darcy said. "I know." "Actually tell him. Don't soften it." "I know how to talk to people, Darcy." "I know you do. I also know you have a tendency to leave the difficult parts for later because you're afraid they'll scare people off, and then they're still there in month 4 and you're dealing with them in a worse position." Lena was quiet. "That's annoyingly accurate." "I know. It's why you called me." A brief sound. Darcy moving in her studio, the rattle of something ceramic. "Call him, Lena, not because everything is resolved, because you're not going to figure out what you want by thinking about it alone on a mountain." "I figured out a lot of things alone on a mountain." "You've survived a lot of things alone on a mountain," Darcy corrected. "That's not the same." Lena didn't answer right away. She turned the letter over in her hands, feeling the weight of the legal pad paper, the slight indentations where his pen had pressed. "I'll think about it," she said. "You've been thinking about it for 6 months." "I'm not done," Darcy laughed, the full, unguarded laugh that was one of the things Lena liked best about her. "All right. Call me when you are." She hung up. Lena put the phone down. She cut a slice of the bread, still slightly warm, and ate it standing at the counter in the last of the evening light, and thought about what Darcy had said. Surviving and figuring out are not the same. She didn't call him that night or the next day. She waited 4 days, which was not quite enough time to know what she meant, and was definitely enough time to know that she was stalling. On the 5th day, she was outside early in the morning repairing a section of the fence line at the edge of the property. A post had heaved with the spring thaw and come loose, and she'd been avoiding it because fence repair was the kind of job that required 2 people or a lot of patience, and she only had the one option. When she drove a nail wrong and hit her thumb with the hammer, and sat down in the grass and said several things out loud that she was glad there was no one present to hear. She sat there for a minute, holding her thumb and looking at the loose fence post and thinking about the fact that she'd been trying to tamp this post back in by herself for 3 weeks and had not succeeded and was now sitting in the grass with a bruised thumb in the morning. And this was, if she was honest with herself, not a metaphor she needed to work very hard to interpret. She got up, she went inside. She washed her hands and looked at her thumb. Not bad, would bruise, nothing broken. And she picked up the phone. She called him. It rang twice. Lena. He said her name the way he'd said it in January, without surprise, without performance, as though he'd been waiting for this particular call and had decided not to pretend otherwise. I got your letter, she said. I know. I assumed. A pause. I wasn't sure you'd read it. I read it 3 times. Okay. A beat. Is that okay? I have things to say to you, she said. I need you to listen without responding until I'm done. All right. She sat down at the table. She'd thought about this but hadn't scripted it, because scripting it felt like the wrong approach, felt like the kind of thing that would come out clean and controlled and miss the actual point. So she thought about what was true and decided to say that. I'm still angry, she said. I want you to know that. Not at the level I was in April, but it's still there. You sat at my table for 2 days and let me make assumptions about who you were, and you had the information to correct those assumptions, and you chose not to. I understand your reasons. I'm not saying your reasons were nothing. I'm saying the choice had a cost, and that cost was mine, not yours, because I'm the one who didn't have the information. She paused. I need you to not argue with that or try to explain it again. I need you to just know that it's still there, and that me calling you doesn't mean it isn't. I know, he said. I hear you. The trust, she stopped. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if you did it because of me or because it was something you needed to do separate from me. And I know you said you weren't doing it to prove anything, but Nathan, that's an enormous thing to do, and I need to be honest with you that it makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to be the reason a person dismantles their life. You're not, he said. You're the reason I looked at it honestly. That's different. Is it? Yes. His voice was steady. The company needed that transition regardless of you. The board had already asked me to consider it. What changed was that I stopped having a reason to hold on to control that I didn't actually need. He paused. You didn't do that. I did that. You just made it harder to pretend I didn't know it needed doing. She was quiet for a moment. I need you to come here, she said. A brief silence on his end. Not surprised. More like he'd been holding his breath and had just released it. Okay, he said. Not to fix things. Not because I've decided anything. I need to see if what was real in January is still real when I know who you actually are and you know that I'm still angry, and when neither of us has a blizzard forcing the situation. She kept her voice level. I need to see if we can be honest with each other when there's no emergency to be honest inside of. That's fair, he said. It might not go the way you're hoping. I'm not hoping for a specific outcome, he said. I'm hoping for an honest conversation. She almost said something then, something warmer than she'd planned. She held it back, not because it wasn't true, but because she wasn't done being careful yet. She'd been not careful once, or rather she'd been careful about the wrong things, and she was still paying for it. Friday, she said. Come Friday. This Friday? Is that a problem? No, he said. No, Friday is fine. Come in the morning. Don't send anyone ahead or make any arrangements. Just come. Just me, he said. Just you. A pause. Lena, he said, and she could hear something working in his voice, some effort of containment that reminded her of January, of the way he'd sat with things without filling them with noise. "Thank you for reading the letter, for calling." "Don't thank me yet," she said, which was what she'd said to him in January, standing in the doorway with 4 stitches in his eyebrow. He remembered it. She could tell by the quality of the silence that followed. "Okay," he said. She hung up. She sat at the table for a moment. Titsum. Then she got up and went back outside and finished the fence post, and this time she held the post with both hands and drove the nails straight, and it wasn't perfect, but it held. She spent Thursday cleaning the cabin, which she told herself was because the cabin needed cleaning and not because someone was coming. Both were true. She swept and scrubbed and aired out the storage room and reorganized the kitchen cabinet where the first aid kit lived. And somewhere in the middle of scrubbing the kitchen floor, she sat back on her heels and laughed at herself, alone in the cabin, genuinely laughed at the absurdity of the situation and at herself for being in it. She called Darcy. "He's coming Friday," she said when Darcy picked up. "Lena." Darcy's voice was approximately 40% louder than necessary. "What did he say?" "He said okay. He said he's not hoping for a specific outcome." That's exactly what a man says when he's hoping for a very specific outcome and is smart enough not to say so. "I know," Lena said. "I also think he meant it." "Both can be true." "Both are usually true," Lena agreed. She looked around the cabin. Swept, aired, the bread rack empty and clean, the wood stove cold in July, the chair by the window with the book she'd been reading face down on the seat, the photograph on the mantel, her father's even jaw, her mother's full smile, herself at 7 squinting into the sun. "How do you feel?" Darcy asked. "Nervous," Lena said, "which is annoying. It means it matters." "I know what it means." She paused. "What if it's different? In person, now that I know who he is, what if it just—" She stopped. "What if the thing that was real in January doesn't survive the context?" Darcy said, more gently than her usual register. "Yeah." "Then you'll know," Darcy said, "and that's better than not knowing." She knew Darcy was right. She also knew that knowing something was better than not knowing did nothing to make the not knowing yet any more comfortable. She thanked Darcy and put the phone down and made dinner and went to bed early and did not sleep well, which was fair. He arrived at 9:15 Friday morning. She heard the car, a rental, she assumed, something unremarkable, coming up the ridge road 20 minutes before it appeared, the sound carrying in the mountain air the way sounds do when everything else is quiet. She was outside when he pulled up, not because she'd been waiting, but because she'd been carrying firewood in from the pile and had decided not to stop just because a car was coming. He stepped out. He looked like himself. That was the first thing. She'd been half afraid he'd look like the headshot, the dark suit version, and he didn't. He was in jeans and a flannel shirt and boots that were better quality than his January boots, but not conspicuously so, and he had a bag over his shoulder and he was carrying something, a paper bag, smallish. And he looked tired in the way that people look when they haven't been sleeping quite right for a while. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "The fence line," he said finally, nodding toward the repaired section at the property edge. "Post heaved," she said. "It's fixed now." He nodded. He came toward her and stopped at a reasonable distance, not reaching for anything, not filling the space with words. That was still the same, the willingness to let silence be silence. She looked at the bag he was carrying. "What's that?" "Coffee," he said. "The good kind. I didn't know if you needed it or if it was presumptuous, so I almost didn't bring it, but then I thought—" He stopped. "I thought it was probably fine." She almost smiled. Almost. "Come inside," she said. He followed her in. The cabin was the same cabin. She watched him register that. The sweep of his eyes around the room, the wood stove, the bookshelf, the photograph on the mantel. The kitchen with its window whose gap didn't let cold air through anymore. The chair where they'd sat in the candlelight. He set the coffee on the kitchen counter. He stood with his hands at his sides and didn't touch anything, didn't move to make himself at home. Waited. She put water on. "Sit down," she said. He sat at the table, the same chair as January. She noticed that he'd chosen it without thinking, or maybe with thinking, and she couldn't tell which and decided it didn't matter. She got the mugs. She sat across from him. For a moment they just looked at each other, the way people do when they've said the important things in a letter and a phone call, and now need to figure out what the real thing is beneath all of it. "I don't know where to start," he said. "Then don't start anywhere in particular," she said. "Just talk." "About what?" "Anything true." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I miss this," he said. Not in a romantic way, or not only. I missed talking to someone who wasn't inside the situation, who didn't need me to be anything specific. He looked at his hands on the table. My whole life is people who need me to be something specific. Even the good ones. Even Marcus, who is genuinely a good person and a good colleague. He needs me to be the CEO, or the recovering from CEO, or something legible. Sophie needs me to be dad. The board needs me to be whatever they've decided I am this quarter. He looked up. You needed me to be a person, that's all, and I couldn't even do that honestly. You did it honestly, she said. You did most of it honestly. You left out one large fact. A defining fact. Yes, she said. A defining fact. She poured the coffee, his coffee, the good kind, and it was good, she could tell from the smell. And she pushed his mug across the table. I want to ask you something, she said. Okay. If the storm hadn't happened, if you hadn't crashed, if we'd met some other way, at a store, a restaurant, somewhere normal, would you have told me who you were immediately? He thought about it. She watched him think, the way he did it, without reaching for an answer before he had one. Probably not immediately, he said, but faster, within the first conversation, because I would have had my phone on me. A pause. Because I wouldn't have had the option of being nobody. My office would have been calling. So the crash gave you the option. Yes. And you took it. Yes. And part of why you took it, she said, keeping her voice even, was because you were tired of being Nathan Ashcroft, and for 2 days you could be someone else. Yes, he said. That's accurate, and it's not fair to you. No, she said. It's not. She held her mug. He held his. The water was boiling for the coffee, and she'd already made it, which meant the kettle was just making noise, and she got up and turned off the burner. When she sat back down, she said, I don't think you're a bad person. That's a low bar. It's the one we're starting with, she said. We can raise it later. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but in the general direction of one. There and gone. The trust, she said. I've been thinking about it since the letter. Tell me what it actually felt like to sign it. He looked at her. Why? Because the letter says what you did. I want to know what it felt like to do it. He was quiet for a moment. Terrifying, he said, and lighter. Immediately lighter. In the parking lot of Daniel's office, I sat in the car for about 5 minutes, and I kept waiting for the regret, and it didn't come. He paused. I've been waiting for it since. It still hasn't come. That tells you something. It tells me something. Does it scare you? She asked. Not having it to hold? He looked at her steadily. Yes, but it scared me more to realize that's why I was holding it. She nodded slowly. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the window with the gap he'd packed, the light coming through it clean and clear in the July morning. Okay, she said. Okay? He said it carefully, like the word might mean more than one thing. Okay, as in, I hear you. I believe you. She looked at him. That doesn't mean I'm not saying everything is resolved. I'm not saying I trust you completely yet. I'm saying I believe what you're telling me right now. That's enough, he said. That's more than enough. Don't be grateful yet, she said. I'm still angry about parts of it. I know. I'm going to keep being angry about parts of it for a while. I know that too. She set down her mug. She looked at him across the table. This man who had crashed into her life and her wood supply and her carefully managed solitude, who had fixed her door and burned her onions and looked at her father's photograph and said nothing about it but somehow said exactly the right thing, who had written a letter in bad handwriting and mailed it from a post office himself with a crooked stamp. You should know, she said, that this cabin, this life, is not simple. I don't have money right now. I'm trying to start a business, a bakery. I've been working on the plan for months, and I don't know if it'll work. My truck has 2 flat tires, and I've been putting off fixing them because I can't afford both at once. I am not a person whose life is together. She held his gaze. I need you to not try to fix those things. I need you to let me fix them. I understand, he said. I mean it. If I find out you quietly sorted my truck or made a call to anyone or sent any kind of, Lena. His voice was quiet and direct. I hear you. She studied him. The tires, she said. How many did you notice when you drove up? He paused. 2 flat? And your first instinct was to fix them, he said honestly. My second instinct was to not. That's progress, she said. He almost laughed. She heard it, the contained edge of it. Yeah, he said. I'm working on it. She stood up. She went to the kitchen. She found the bread knife and cut 2 slices of yesterday's loaf and put them on a plate and brought it back to the table. Eat, she said. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, she said for the 3rd time. His face did something then, genuine, unguarded, the specific expression of a person who has been caught by something they didn't expect to feel. He covered it by picking up the bread. She sat down. They ate. The morning moved around them. Outside, the aspens were moving in the light wind, and the hawk was back over the meadow, and the mountain was doing what it had always done, solid and indifferent and enormously present. Tell me about the bakery, he said. She looked up. Tell me your plan, he said. From the beginning. So she did. She told him about the permit she'd applied for, the commercial kitchen inspection requirements, the small storefront she'd been looking at 40 miles down the valley in the nearest actual town, the product range she'd worked out, bread, obviously, but also pastries, a few savory items, the kind of thing that worked in a rural mountain town where the nearest good bakery was 60 miles in the wrong direction. She'd been keeping notes for 7 months. She had a business plan drafted, imperfect, in a notebook. She'd talked to the small business development office in the county seat, and they'd told her she was viable. He listened. He didn't offer anything. He asked one question, what's your biggest constraint right now? And she said startup capital and the inspection requirements for the commercial kitchen, and he nodded and said nothing else, and she appreciated deeply that he said nothing else. When she was done, he said, It's a good plan. You don't know enough about it to know if it's a good plan, she said. I know enough about business fundamentals to know the structure is sound, he said. The rest depends on execution, and you clearly know how to execute things. He paused. I believe it'll work. She looked at him. Why? Because you finished the fence post, he said. She stared at him for a moment, then she picked up her coffee. That's a strange reason, she said. It's an accurate one. She didn't argue with it because he wasn't wrong. The fence post and the business plan and the bread rising under the cloth and the cabin cleaned for company, it didn't actually need to be cleaned for. All the same thing, the same quality, the willingness to deal with the thing in front of you until it was dealt with. I want to visit again, he said. Not today. I mean, after today. I want to come back. I know you do, she said. I'm not asking for more than that, just the possibility of it. She looked at him across the table. The morning light was falling across the tabletop between them, the particular July angle of it, warm and exact. Next Friday, she said. If you want. Yes, he said. Bring Sophie, she said. He went very still. She saw it happen, the stillness of someone receiving something they hadn't known they were hoping for. She'd like that, he said. I know, Lena said. She's been in my kitchen since January, apparently. She said it dryly, but she let the warmth underneath it come through, just slightly, just enough. Tell her the bread will be better than last time. Nathan looked at her. Last time yours fell on one side. Mine was fine, she said. Yours was the geological event. He laughed. Not the contained almost laugh from before. A real one, sudden and unguarded. And it was the same as January, the same quality, the same realness. and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for 6 months. Not everything, not even most things, but something. She didn't say so. She picked up his empty plate and took it to the sink and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking out the repaired window at the mountain. She heard him behind her, the sound of him standing, the slight shift of the chair on the floor. "I should go," he said. "Sophie's with Mrs. Ellison, and I told her I'd be back by dinner." "Okay," Lena said. She turned around. He was standing by the table with his bag over his shoulder, and she walked him to the door the way she'd walked the Denver Post reporter to the door in February, except this was nothing like that. On the porch, he stopped. "Lena," he said. "I know," she said, and somehow that was enough, because it was the truth. She did know. She knew what he would have said, and she knew she didn't need him to say it yet, and she knew that knowing it was enough for today, for this Friday, for this particular piece of ground they were standing on. He went to the car. He didn't look back until he reached it, and when he did, she was standing on the porch with her arms folded against the morning chill, and she looked back at him without expression, just looked, and that was enough of that too. He drove down the ridge road. She stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded into the mountain quiet. Then she went back inside. She put the mugs in the sink. She looked at the table where his coffee cup had been. She had a lot of things to figure out still. She knew that. The anger was still there, in places, not gone just because an honest conversation had happened. Trust was not a door you unlocked once and left open. It was a thing you built over time with materials that had to be actual, specific, observed, repeated. She had no idea what any of this looked like at 90 days or a year or longer. She had no idea how you built something real across the distance between a cabin in the Colorado mountains and a life in Connecticut that had a board of directors and 2,000 employees and a Wikipedia page. She didn't know. What she knew was that next Friday she would make bread. She would make it correctly, with the proper score on the top, and it would rise the way it was supposed to, and there would be a 6-year-old at the table who had drawn her into a family portrait without anyone asking her to. That was what she knew. She picked up the notebook with the bakery business plan and took it to the table and sat down and opened it to where she'd left off, and she kept working. Sophie Ashcroft was not a shy child. This was relevant because most 6-year-olds arriving at an unfamiliar cabin at the end of a dirt road in the Colorado mountains would have stood close to their parents' leg and watched things from a careful distance before deciding the situation was safe. Sophie did not do this. Sophie climbed out of the rental car, looked at the cabin for approximately 4 seconds, looked at the woman standing on the porch, and said, "Are you the bread lady?" Lena looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at the sky. "My name is Lena," Lena said. "I know," Sophie said. "Dad told me. But you're also the bread lady." "I make bread," Lena agreed. "Yes." "Dad tried to make bread, and it caved in on one side," Sophie said, with the merciless accuracy of a person who has not yet learned the social utility of softening information. "He said yours was better." "His was a geological event," Lena said. Sophie considered this. "What's geological?" "To do with the earth. Rocks. Layers of things that happened over a long time." Sophie looked at her father. "Your bread was like rocks?" "It was edible," Nathan said, with the dignity of a man accepting his circumstances. "Barely," Lena said, and stepped aside to let them in. That was the beginning of it, not the beginning of everything. The beginning had been a January night and a bleeding man at the door and a decision made in 3 seconds in a draft. But the beginning of the particular thing that grew from one Friday to the next, slowly and imperfectly, and with no guarantee at any point that it would continue. Sophie was in the cabin for 6 minutes before she found the beluga whale book on the bottom shelf of the bookshelf, a natural history of cetaceans, old, with glossy photographs that had gone slightly soft with age, and she pulled it out and brought it to the kitchen table and said, to no one in particular, "This has belugas in it." She sat down and opened it and began reading, or looking at the pictures and narrating what she saw, which was her version of reading. Lena watched her for a moment and then went back to the bread she'd been shaping, and the kitchen had a quality to it that afternoon that Lena didn't try to name because naming it felt like it might break it. Nathan sat at the table across from his daughter and watched Lena work, And the three of them existed in the same room with a quiet that had no performance in it. And that was the thing Lena kept coming back to in the weeks that followed. How quickly the performance left the room when Sophie was in it. Children had no investment in anyone's image. Sophie talked to Lena the way she talked to anyone she'd decided to include in her world, directly, with complete unselfconsciousness, about whatever was actually on her mind. She asked Lena if she was lonely living by herself on a mountain. She asked if the hawk outside was the same hawk every time or different hawks. She asked, on the third Friday, whether Lena's father had died because she'd seen the photograph on the mantel and the man in it was not there. "He did," Lena said. "Mine died too," Sophie said. "My mom." "I know," Lena said. "Your dad told me." Sophie looked at the photograph. "Do you miss him?" "Every day." Sophie nodded, the nod of someone who has filed this away alongside her own experience and found the correlation useful. "I miss my mom, but I don't remember her very much," she said. "Dad says that's okay, that the missing is still real even if the memory isn't." Lena looked at Nathan, who was very carefully looking at his coffee. "Your dad's right," she said. Sophie accepted this and moved on to asking whether the bread was ready yet. That was the third Friday. By the fifth, Sophie had developed a habit of going directly to the bookshelf upon arrival and selecting the book she wanted to look at, a selection process that involved standing in front of the shelf with her arms crossed and a serious expression before making a decision. She'd worked through the Cetacean book, a field guide to Colorado birds, and was currently working through a collection of nature essays that were well above her reading level but which she engaged with by looking at the chapter headings and asking Lena to explain what they meant. Lena explained. Sophie listened with the particular attention of someone who takes information seriously. Nathan watched this happen over 6 consecutive Fridays and said nothing about it, but Lena could see what it was doing to him. The particular quality of quiet that settled on him when Sophie was engaged and safe, and in the care of someone who was paying genuine attention. The kind of quiet that comes from being able to set something down for a moment. She understood it because she'd watched her father have the same quality of quiet when she was small and occupied, and he could just sit and be, without managing anything. She understood it, and she let him have it without commenting. That was August. September came in cool, the aspens beginning their turn, the mountain going from green to that specific gold that made the whole valley look like something deliberate, like a choice someone made. Lena's bakery permit came through on a Thursday in the second week of September, and she sat at the kitchen table with the official document in her hands for a long time before she called Darcy. "It's real," she said when Darcy picked up. Darcy made a sound that was mostly just volume. "When do you open?" "I need the kitchen inspection first, then the space, the storefront in Millhaven. I've been talking to the landlord. It's affordable if I can get the first 6 months right." She paused. "I need another 8 weeks, maybe 10. "You'll be open by November." "Maybe, if everything goes right." "Things will go right," Darcy said, with the certainty of someone who has no practical stake in the outcome. "You know what you're doing." Lena wasn't sure she knew what she was doing. She knew how to make bread. She knew the plan looked viable on paper. Between those two things and an actual working bakery was a considerable amount of territory that she'd never personally navigated, and the small business development office's encouragement, while genuine, did not translate directly into competence. But she'd started the permit process in April, in the middle of everything else, in the middle of being angry and uncertain and thinking about a letter on a legal pad. She'd kept working on the plan while all of that was happening. That meant something. She wasn't sure exactly what, but it meant something. She told Nathan about the permit on Friday. He was sitting at the table and she set the document in front of him without preamble, and he read it. "Congratulations," he said. "Don't make it into something yet," she said. "It's just the permit." "It's not just the permit." "Nathan, I know," he said. "I'm not going to offer you anything. I'm just—" He looked at the document and then at her. "I'm proud of you. I'm allowed to say that." She looked at him for a moment. "You're allowed to say that," she conceded. Sophie, from across the room, said, "What's a permit?" "Permission to do something," Lena said. "What are you doing?" "Opening a bakery." Sophie looked up from the bird book. "With bread?" With bread. Will there be other things? Yes. Sophie appeared to process this. Can I come? When it opens, Lena said, you can come. Sophie nodded, satisfied, and went back to the bird book. Nathan looked at Lena across the table, and she looked back at him, and whatever was in his face, careful, warm, something he'd stopped trying to fully contain, she let herself see without looking away. That was September. There were hard Fridays. The 6th Friday, Nathan arrived 40 minutes late because of a flight delay out of Hartford, and Sophie was tired and had cried in the car about something that had happened at school that week, a falling out with her best friend Iris, brief but serious in the way that first-grade social ruptures are always serious. And she came into the cabin with red-rimmed eyes and a dignity that was heartbreaking in a 7-year-old. Lena made her tea with honey, which Sophie had never had before, and sat with her at the table while Nathan brought in the bags, and Sophie explained the Iris situation with the forensic detail of someone presenting evidence. Lena listened. All of it. That sounds really hard, she said, when Sophie had finished. It is, Sophie said. She said I was being bossy. Were you? A pause. Sophie's expression shifted. The particular shift of a child encountering an adult who is going to be honest with them. Maybe a little, she said. Okay, Lena said. So what do you do with that? I don't know. You think about whether it's true, Lena said. If it is, you figure out if you want to change it. If you don't want to change it, you accept that some people won't like that about you. If you do want to change it, you try. She paused. That's all anyone can do. Sophie stared at her. That's what my dad says. Almost exactly. Your dad is not always wrong, Lena said. Sophie looked at her father, who had just come through the door with the bags and had clearly heard the last exchange. He met Lena's eyes briefly over Sophie's head. His expression was something she still didn't have a complete word for, even after 3 months of Fridays. That was the 6th Friday, and it was hard, but not in the way that broke anything. Hard. In the way that ordinary life is hard. The accumulated friction of real people with real troubles, which is what you have when you stop performing and start actually being somewhere. The 8th Friday, Nathan and Lena had their first real argument. It was about the bakery. Specifically, it was about a conversation Nathan had had with someone without telling Lena he was going to have it. Not a financial arrangement, not an offer, just a conversation with a friend of his who happened to run a specialty food distribution network in the Mountain West. A conversation in which Nathan had described the bakery and apparently spoken about it with enough enthusiasm that the friend had asked for more details, and Nathan had provided them. He told her about it. He told her because he wasn't going to not tell her, because not telling her something was the mistake he'd already made once, and he wasn't willing to make again in any form. But the telling was still difficult because Lena's reaction was immediate and clear, and came with the particular edge that appears when someone has told you something they need, and you've understood it intellectually and then walked into the exact corner of it anyway. I told you not to make calls, she said. I didn't make a call. I had a conversation with someone I know. About my bakery. About a bakery someone I care about is opening. Nathan, her voice was flat. We talked about this. I need to build this myself. If it succeeds, I need it to have succeeded because I did the work. If it fails, it's not going to fail. If it fails, she said, overriding him, I need to have failed on my own terms, with my own effort, not in the shadow of your network. She stopped. You know why. He was quiet for a moment, because of the person before. Because of every person who has ever done something for me that I didn't ask for, and then held it, even without meaning to, even without knowing they were doing it. It was still there. She looked at him steadily. I know you meant well. I know you weren't thinking of it that way. But I need you to hear me when I tell you something like this. I hear you, Tet, he said. Really hear me. Not agree to end the conversation, hear me. Lena. His voice was quiet and direct, and she could see that he was not retreating from it, was not finding a way around it, was standing in it. I hear you. I will not do it again, and I want to say... He stopped, started again. You're right. I didn't do it with intention, but intention doesn't cover everything. You told me what you needed, and I walked into it anyway. I'm sorry. She looked at him. "Okay," she said. After a moment, "Okay." It didn't resolve perfectly. She was still irritated for the rest of that afternoon in a low-grade way that she didn't try to hide, and he let her be irritated without trying to fix it or apologize his way out of it. And eventually the irritation settled into the background the way things do when they've been acknowledged properly and don't need to keep announcing themselves. Sophie, who had been in the other room during this exchange and had heard the raised voices, not shouting, but the particular controlled tension of adults disagreeing, came to the kitchen doorway and assessed the situation and then said, "Are you fighting?" "We were having a disagreement," Nathan said. "What about?" "Adult things," Nathan said. Sophie looked at Lena. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Lena said. "Did he do something wrong?" "Sophie," Nathan started. "Yes," Lena said, "he did. And he apologized. And now we're moving forward." Sophie considered this with the gravity of a small person encountering the information that adults can do things wrong, apologize, and continue existing in the same space. She seemed to find this reasonable. "Okay," she said, and went back to the bird book. Nathan looked at Lena. "She's going to be terrifying when she's 15, Lena said. "She's terrifying now," he said. And despite everything, despite the argument and the irritation still present in the room, Lena felt something pull at the corner of her mouth. That was the 8th Friday. The bakery opened on a Tuesday in early November, which was not a Friday, so Nathan and Sophie weren't there for the opening. Lena had not asked them to come, and Nathan had not offered because they'd both learned by then to let things be what they were. The bakery was Lena's thing, the opening was Lena's moment, and some things belonged to the person who'd built them. Darcy was there. Darcy came with flowers and volume and a banner she'd made herself in the pottery studio using paint and a piece of canvas that read "Lena's Bread" in letters that were charmingly uneven, and she hung it in the window of the small storefront in Millhaven without asking, and Lena didn't tell her to take it down because it was accurate and because Darcy had driven 40 miles in November to be there. The first day was slow. 4 customers in the morning, 6 in the afternoon. Lena had expected slow and had planned for it and wasn't panicked by it. The bread sold, all of what she'd brought, by close, which was not a huge quantity, but it sold. A woman came in and bought 2 loaves and a bag of cheese rolls and said she'd been waiting for a bakery in Millhaven for 10 years, and Lena thanked her and meant it. She drove home in the November dark with the car smelling like bread, and the storefront behind her dark and locked, her name on the door and the hand-lettered sign she'd made herself, and she felt something that was not triumph. Triumph felt too large for one Tuesday, but something in the neighborhood of rightness, of things being in their correct place. She called Nathan from the car. "How was it?" he said. 4 customers in the morning, 6 in the afternoon, sold everything. "Good start." "It's a very small start." "Every start is." She drove through the mountain dark with the phone on speaker and the heater running and said, "Darcy made a banner." "What did it say?" "Lena's Bread in very large paint." "That's accurate." "It really is," she said. A pause. "I'm glad it's real," he said. Not, "I'm proud of you" again, though she knew that was in there. He'd learned, in 3 months of Fridays, some of the specific texture of what she needed, which was not the accomplishment itself recognized, but the reality of it. The fact that it existed now in the world and was hers. "Me too," she said. She drove home. The mountain was dark and enormous around her, and the road was empty, and the headlights picked out the pines one after another, and she thought about the year that had led to this drive, the crash that had brought a stranger to her door, the 2 days that had been real and then complicated, the anger and the letter and the bad handwriting and the Fridays. All of it leading to this particular Tuesday in November, driving home from the first day of a thing she'd built. Life did not organize itself into neat lessons. She knew that. But she also knew, with the quiet certainty that comes from paying attention, that the year had changed something in her that was not going to change back. The part of her that had come to this mountain in the posture of someone who'd stopped expecting much, that part was gone, or going. Not replaced by optimism, which had never been her register, but by something sturdier. The willingness to expect things, to try for things, to fix the fence post even when her thumb hurt. She got home, She fed the stove, she made tea. She looked at the photograph on the mantel, her father and her mother and herself at 7, and she thought, all right, I'm still here. I'm building things. She went to bed. She slept well. December arrived with snow that was gentler than January's blizzard, the early winter kind that came in dry and fine and stayed. The ridge road iced over most mornings, but Lena had the truck running again by then. Both tires fixed, a job she'd saved for and done herself at the garage in town, a satisfaction disproportionate to the task. And she drove it carefully and without incident. The bakery was finding its rhythm. Not a flood of customers. Millhaven was a small town, and small towns build loyalty slowly, but a steady increase, week by week. The cheese rolls were developing a following. A restaurant in the next town had placed a weekly wholesale order for sourdough loaves. The numbers were thin, but they were moving in the right direction, and Lena knew the difference between thin but viable and thin but dying, and this was the former. On the first Friday of December, Nathan came alone. Sophie had a fever. Nothing serious, a winter cold. Mrs. Ellison was with her. But he'd come anyway, and Lena hadn't told him not to. He arrived in the late morning looking like someone who'd been up most of the night listening to a sick child breathe, which he had been. He sat at the table and she gave him coffee and didn't say anything about his appearance, which was considerate because he looked exhausted. "She's fine," he said preemptively. "Temperature's down this morning." "I know, you texted." "Right." He held the mug. "I almost didn't come." "But you did." "Yeah." He looked around the cabin, the particular scan of someone who finds a place settled something in them upon arriving. "I'm glad I did." She sat across from him. Outside the window, the December snow was falling in that slow, unhurried way that means it'll go on for hours, so not a storm, just winter being winter, persistent and quiet. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "Okay." He set down his mug. He looked at his hands on the table, the same gesture from July, from their first real conversation after everything came out. The same honesty-preparing gesture. "The CEO search is finishing up," he said. "The trust has identified 2 final candidates. There's going to be an announcement in January." "Okay," she said. "How do you feel about it?" "Relieved, mostly. One of the candidates is genuinely excellent, someone named Park. She comes from the medical supply side, which is exactly what the Meredith acquisition needs. If they choose her, I'll sleep very well." He paused. "I'll still be on the board. I'll still be involved in strategic direction. But the day-to-day..." He stopped. "It's strange. I keep reaching for the responsibility, and it's not there anymore. And most of the time that's fine, but occasionally it feels like a missing tooth," Lena said. He looked at her. "Yeah, exactly like that." "That's normal," she said. "You'll stop reaching for it eventually." "Have you stopped reaching for the Denver life?" She considered. "Mostly. Some mornings I wake up and for about 30 seconds I'm in the apartment and I have the job and the person, and then I'm here, and there's this moment of dislocation." She paused. "But here's better. I know that now without having to think about it. The knowing comes before the thinking." He was quiet, absorbing this. "That's what I'm waiting for," he said. "The knowing coming before the thinking." "It takes time," she said. "You signed those papers 6 months ago. Give it a year." "A year," he repeated. "At least." He nodded. He picked up his mug. He said without looking at her, with the careful tone of someone raising something they've been approaching slowly, "I want to talk about next year." "We're talking about it." "I mean..." He looked up. "More than the company. I mean us. The Fridays." He paused. "I don't want to keep doing it the way we've been doing it if it's not going to go anywhere. Not because I need it to go somewhere specific, but because I don't want to, He stopped. "I don't want to be something you try out indefinitely, and I don't want you to be something I do once a week and hold at a careful distance because neither of us is ready to say what this actually is." She looked at him for a long moment. "What do you think this is?" she said. He held her gaze. "I think this is the most honest relationship I've had since my wife died," he said. "I think you're one of the few people in my life who doesn't need anything from me that I can provide through money or authority or the version of me that shows up in business press. I think Sophie talks about you more than she talks about most people in her life. He paused. I think when I drive up this road on Friday mornings, I feel something I haven't felt reliably in a very long time. What does it feel like? She said, the same question she'd asked him in July about signing the papers. Like I know where I am, he said. She sat with that. It was a plain sentence. It didn't ask for anything extravagant. She thought about all the ways a person could say what he'd just said, more eloquently, more strategically, with more ornamentation, and how none of those versions would have landed the same way. Like I know where I am. I've been afraid, she said. The admission came out more easily than she'd expected, which meant it had been close to the surface for a while. Not of you specifically, of what happens if this becomes real and then it becomes something that gets lost. I've had a hard few years and I know what I'm like when things fall apart. And I don't... She stopped. I don't want to be that person again. I know, he said. You don't know what that person is like. No, he said. But I know what it's like to hold yourself at a distance from something good. Because you're afraid of what losing it would do. I spent 3 years doing that with Sophie. Not with her, but with everything that wasn't her. Keeping the company and the routine and the structure all held very tightly so that I never had to be in a position of losing something I didn't expect to need. She looked at him. That's why you came to the cabin in January, she said. Not a question. That's why I was in the air in a blizzard, in a small plane, he said. Because I was filling every available space with purpose, so I didn't have to sit still. He paused. And then the engine quit, and I had nothing left to fill the space with. And you walked to my door. And I walked to your door. She looked out the window. The snow was still falling, easy and quiet. The ridge road was white and still. No wind today, just the silent accumulation of December. I'm not afraid of this becoming real, she said finally. I'm afraid of being wrong about it. About you. That's fair, he said. I've been wrong before. About a person. About what they were. I know. Being wrong about you would be worse, she said, because I know what you're capable of, and I've chosen it with open eyes. And that means if I'm wrong, it's not just bad luck. It's a failure of judgment. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the snow. The mountain, holding everything with its usual indifference. I can't promise you won't be wrong, he said. I can't give you that guarantee because it doesn't exist, and making it would be the kind of thing I don't do anymore. He leaned forward slightly. What I can tell you is that I have made exactly 2 decisions in the last year that were not calculated, not strategic, not managed for outcome. One of them was writing that letter. The other was giving up operational control of the company. He paused. Both of them pointed at the same direction. I think that's worth something. She thought about the letter, the crooked stamp, the bad handwriting getting slightly better as it went. The paragraph about Sophie's drawing that had nothing to do with making a case and everything to do with just telling the truth. It is, she said. It's worth something. Then let me keep showing up, he said, not just on Fridays. Let me be part of this. However that looks, whatever pace makes sense, whatever terms you need, let me be in it. She looked at him across the table. The man who'd walked out of a blizzard and into her cabin and fixed her door and burned her onions and let her teach him about axe work without any diminishment of himself whatsoever. The man who'd written a letter and signed papers and driven up a mountain road 12 consecutive Fridays because he said he would. The man whose daughter had put her in a crayon family portrait and called her the bread lady like it was the most natural categorization in the world. Sophie, she said, she knows this is more than just Fridays. Sophie knows everything, he said. She's known since approximately the 3rd visit. What did she say? She said, and I'm quoting, Lena looks at you the way Mrs. Ellison looks at her garden. He paused. I'm still working out exactly what that means. Lena sat with that for a moment. Then she put her hands flat on the table, both of them, a steadying gesture she recognized as her father's. You can keep showing up, she said. He held very still. Not just Fridays, she said, but you have to understand that we're still building this. It's not done. It's not going to be done for a long time. I know. And there will be more arguments. I assume so. And I'm going to be difficult sometimes, she said. I live alone on a mountain, and I've been running on my own for a year and a half, and I have habits and requirements that don't disappear because someone I like is in my kitchen. I know, he said. I'm difficult too. I have an entire board of directors who could explain this at length. She almost smiled. The almost smile made it all the way, this time. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. Neither of them moved for a moment, and the snow kept falling outside, and the stove ticked, and the cabin did what it had always done, held them, without asking anything of them, without requiring a performance. Then Lena stood up and got the bread she'd made that morning, a proper loaf, correctly scored, risen exactly as it should, and put it on the table between them with butter and a knife. And Nathan cut 2 slices and passed one to her and kept one, and they ate in the December quiet of a cabin in the mountains. And it was not perfect. Nothing about any of it was, or had ever been perfect. And that was exactly what made it real. That winter, Lena Brooks ran her bakery through its first 3 months and found a rhythm that worked. The wholesale order from the restaurant in the next town became 2 restaurants. The cheese rolls became a thing, and people drove 30 minutes to get on Saturday mornings. She hired part-time help, a college student named Marco, who was studying hospitality and who had strong opinions about sourdough starter that Lena mostly agreed with, which made him genuinely useful. The numbers stayed thin but moved consistently in the right direction. She also made peace with the mountain in a different way than before. Not the survivalist relationship of her first year, the woodpile counted, the propane managed, the isolation endured, but something more like an actual life. Darcy came most Sundays. The Ridge Road was a commute now, not a barrier. The cabin was still the cabin, still her father's walls and her father's tools and the photograph on the mantel, but it held things now that it hadn't before. And those things changed the quality of the rooms in a way she hadn't expected. Not noisier, just inhabited. In January, the Ashcroft Operational Trust announced that Dr. Sandra Park would be assuming the role of CEO of Ashcroft Logistics, effective March 1st. The announcement was covered briefly in the business press. The stock held steady. Marcus sent Nathan a text that said, "Only she's the right choice," and Nathan sent back, "I know," and that was more or less the whole of it. Nathan sat with the announcement for a day. He'd known it was coming. He'd been in the room for the final decision. But seeing it published, his name followed by former CEO in the byline of the business profile, was its own particular thing, the way certain facts don't become real until they're in print. He sat with it, and then he called Sophie. "Dr. Park is the new CEO," he told her. "Is she good?" Sophie asked. "Very good." "Better than you?" He thought about it. "At some things, not others." "That's fair," Sophie said, with the impartial judgment of someone who thinks fairness is the most important quality in an assessment. "Are you sad?" "A little," he said. "It's okay to be sad about things even when they're the right things," Sophie said. He sat with this. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. A brief pause. "Lena," Sophie said. He drove to Colorado the following Friday. He didn't tell Lena about the CEO announcement until they were sitting at the table with the coffee she'd made. He told her plainly, the same way he'd been telling her things for months, without managing the framing. She listened. She said, "How are you?" "Okay," he said. "Genuinely okay. There's a thin layer of sad under the okay, but the okay is real." "The sad is allowed to be there," she said. That's what Sophie said. Lena looked at him. "She's something, your kid." "She quotes you," he said, "constantly, in situations where the quote is accurate." "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation," he said, "one I'm very fond of." She looked at her coffee. Then she looked up at him with the direct look, the one that had been one of the first things he'd registered about her, the look that didn't have an agenda in it, wasn't trying to manage his reaction, was just seeing him. "I'm glad you gave it up," she said. "Not because of us, because of you. I think you needed your hands back." He understood what she meant. Not the literal hands, though that too, though the woodpile and the door hinge and the bread that had gotten incrementally less geological over 12 months of occasional practice. The hands as a metaphor for the thing you do with your actual capacity when you stop gripping what you've already built. Yeah, he said. I think so too. Sophie arrived 2 hours later. Mrs. Ellison had driven her from the airport because Sophie had lobbied for this arrangement, and Mrs. Ellison, who found the whole situation charming in the way that retired teachers find things charming, had agreed. She came through the door with her bag and Frank the beluga whale and went directly to the bookshelf where she'd moved her way through natural history and field guides and was currently working through a book about traditional bread making across different cultures that Lena had found at an estate sale specifically because she'd thought Sophie would like it. This has bread from 17 countries in it, Sophie announced, pulling it off the shelf. I know, Lena said. There's a chapter on Scandinavian rye that I thought you'd find interesting. Sophie looked at her with a 7-year-old's unfiltered appreciation. You remembered. You told me about it last time, Lena said. You were very thorough. Sophie brought the book to the table. She sat down between Nathan and Lena and opened it to the Scandinavian chapter and began to read aloud, which was her preferred mode when she found something worth sharing. Nathan looked at Lena over Sophie's head, and Lena looked back, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that would have improved the moment. The bread in the oven was filling the cabin with the smell of it. The particular warm smell of something rising correctly, yeast and wheat and heat. And outside, the January mountain was doing what mountains do, holding its ground without comment, indifferent to the small human warmth inside the cabin walls. That warmth was specific. It was not generic contentment or the happy ending that stories arrive at and declare finished. It was the warmth of particular people in a particular room, imperfect, still building, carrying the complicated freight of everything that had happened before. Nathan with his 15 years of a company he'd put down, and his wife he'd lost, and his daughter who quoted people back at them with alarming accuracy. Lena with her father's tools and her mother's absence, and the year of hard survival that had ended somewhere around the bread coming out right. Sophie, who was 7, and had already figured out things about people that most adults spent decades avoiding. None of them were done becoming what they were going to be. That was the thing about the stories you're inside of. You can't see the shape of them from where you're standing. You can only see what's in front of you, the next task, the next conversation, the next Friday. Lena had learned something in the years since a man knocked on her door in a blizzard, and it was not a lesson she would have expected. She'd come to the mountain in the posture of someone learning to need less connection, less risk, less exposure to the particular pain that comes from trusting people with the real version of yourself. She'd been good at it. She'd become very efficient at needing less. What she'd learned was that efficiency was not the same as strength. Needing less was not the same as being whole. You could survive indefinitely in the reduced version of yourself, and many people did, and she had nothing but respect for survival. But surviving and living were the conversation Darcy had identified, and Lena had come to understand it from the inside. The fence post was the thing she kept coming back to. 3 weeks of walking past a heaved post, knowing it needed fixing, avoiding it because fixing it required admitting that the things her father had built were hers to maintain now, that there was no one else coming to do it. And then the moment of sitting in the grass with a bruised thumb and looking at the undone work and deciding quietly and without ceremony that it was time. Most things were like that. The moment of decision was almost never dramatic. It was usually just a Tuesday or a Friday or a morning in the grass with your thumb hurting when you finally ran out of reasons to wait. The bread timer went off. Sophie looked up from the book. Nathan looked at Lena. Is it done? Sophie asked. Let's find out, Lena said. She went to the oven. She opened it. The loaf was a deep gold brown. The score on top opened the way it was supposed to. The smell filling the room in a wave that was complete and whole and exactly right. She took it out. She set it on the rack. She tapped the bottom of the loaf, so the hollow sound that means it's baked through, and turned to the table where a man and his daughter were watching her with the specific attention of people who have learned that what comes next will be worth waiting for. 10 minutes, she said. 10 minutes, Sophie repeated, with the patience of someone who had learned from Lena that bread could not be rushed. They waited. The mountain held its ground outside. The snow that had been falling all morning was stopping now, the clouds breaking apart in the west, and through the kitchen window the first thin seam of afternoon sun was finding its way across the yard. across the fixed fence line at the property edge, across the snow that held everything still and clean and present. 10 minutes passed. Lena cut the bread. She passed the first slice to Sophie, who received it with both hands. She passed the second slice to Nathan, who took it without comment, which was how she preferred things. She cut one for herself. It was good bread. Not perfect. The left side had risen slightly higher than the right, a minor asymmetry that didn't affect anything but was there as things were. But good. Genuinely good. The kind of thing you make when you know what you're doing. They ate. Outside, the light was finding more purchase, the clouds continuing to break, and the mountain that had kept its counsel through a January crash and a blizzard and 2 days that changed the direction of things was sitting now in the late afternoon of another January, indifferent as always to the humans inside the cabin, indifferent to what had been lost and what had been built and what was still in progress. But the cabin was warm. The bread was good. A 7-year-old was reading about 17 countries' worth of bread aloud to 2 adults who were listening, and outside the snow was bright in the returning light. And Nathan Ashcroft, who had once fallen out of the sky and found the only landing that mattered, held a piece of good bread in his hands and felt, without reaching for it and without having to think about it first, exactly where he was.